My boss leaned back in his big leather chair. The office was quiet, just the hum of the computer. And the distant city sounds through the window. He had just finished going over my latest project proposal. He didn't say it was bad, he didn't say it was good, he just looked at me with this calm, almost pitying expression. He said, "You know, you're a good worker, you're reliable, but you have to understand how this industry works. It's about connections. It's about a name. You've got talent. But talent alone, it's not enough out there on your own, y'all. Never make it without me." The day I finally left was a Tuesday. I'd timed it perfectly. A major project had just been successfully delivered. My value was at its peak. I prepared a simple professional resignation letter, no drama, no mention of his prophecy. I thanked him for the opportunity when I handed it to him. He was surprised. He tried to counteroffer more money, a better title. He didn't understand it was never about the money or the title. It was about the principle. It was about building something that was mine. Scripts would break, models would spit out garbage. I'd stare at lines of code until my vision blurred, but each failure was a lesson. Slowly, the pieces started to fit. The models began to work, to predict, to generate real insights. I started writing about my process on professional forums. I shared my findings, answered questions. A community began to form. In a year, I was no longer just an employee at a mid-size firm. Online, in this niche world, I was becoming a known entity, a go-to expert on quantitative market analysis. My personal brand was built line of code by line of code, blog post by blog post. I was making myself unignorable, but he was still ignoring me. The breaking point was a client meeting. A major potential client was interested in a new type of risk assessment. My boss spent the meeting talking about his instincts, his years of experience. The clients listened politely, but they were hungry for data. They asked specific technical questions. He couldn't answer. I tried to jump in to translate, but he shot me a look that said, "Know your place." We lost the client. I knew right then I was done. The market was speaking a language he refused to learn, and I was fluent. I gave my notice the next week. The pity in his eyes was almost worse than his condescension. He truly believed I was committing career suicide. He said, "It's a shame, you had potential, but you're throwing it all away. Y'all see how tough it is out there without the brand name behind you." The market correction was swift and stunning. I hung out my shingle as an independent consultant, specializing in the exact data-driven strategies. My old firm mocked. My first client was one that had left them. They'd heard through the online communities I'd nurtured that I was the person to see. That first project was my absolute focus. I delivered something so far beyond what they were used to, so precise and actionable that they not only paid my premium fee, they became a vocal advocate. The demand was immediate. It was a chain reaction. One referral led to another. My calendar filled up. I was no longer just a practitioner, I was the product. And the product was in short supply. Meanwhile, I heard the rumors. My old firm was struggling. Clients were leaving. They were being outpaced by smaller, more agile competitors, companies that thought like I did. They were bypassing the old gatekeeper entirely to work with the person who had the key to the new kingdom. Within 2 years, I had a team, a small, brilliant team of people I'd met in those online courses, or who had read my work. We were a consultancy built not on legacy, but on pure cutting-edge competency. We were the experts now, and that's when I got the call from HR at my old company. They were restructuring. They needed to build a new modern analytics division, and they wanted to discuss a potential partnership. I agreed to a meeting. I walked back into that building, but this time I was the one being ushered into the main conference room. I was the one they were trying to impress. And then the dilemma during the discussions, it became clear their plan was weak. They didn't have the internal knowledge to manage what they wanted to build. The HR director, looking uncomfortable, said, "We do have one senior person with a deep historical knowledge of our client base. We were thinking he could head this up with your guidance, of course." She named my former boss. I felt a strange calm. This wasn't about revenge. This was about business. I said I'd need to speak with him directly. Interview was surreal. He came into the conference room, and the dynamic was inverted. He was trying to project confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He started talking about the old days, about relationships. I listened, then I began asking questions, technical questions, about data infrastructure, about model validation techniques, about our specific methodological approach. I watched him fumble. I watched him try to bluff. The hierarchy of knowledge was laid bare in that room. He declined gracefully. I worked my notice period, diligently tying up loose ends. My calmness I think unnerved him more than any anger would have. He could sense that I wasn't just jumping ship, I was launching my own. Context the history, but I had the future, the skills that the market demanded right now. I offered him the job, but I was very specific about the structure. He would be a senior advisor. His value was his institutional memory, his understanding of the legacy clients we might acquire. But he would report to the director of analytics, who was a 26-year-old data whiz on my team. His role was to provide context, not direction. He would be a resource, not a leader. He had to accept that the expertise, the authority had shifted. He took the job. I think his pride was outweighed by practicality. He needed the work now. He sits in an open-plan workspace, not a corner office. He comes to me, or rather to my director, for approval on his contributions. Sometimes I see him struggling with the new software, and a part of me remembers the young analyst. I was desperate for guidance. He refused to give. There's no triumph in it, just a quiet, profound lesson. His power was always conditional. It was based on controlling a static body of knowledge. My power is generative. It's based on my ability to learn, to adapt, to create new knowledge. In the end, "Y'all never make it without me" was a confession. It was his fear that he could no longer make it without the position. He held the real source of power. Isn't a title on a door, it's the skills you carry in your head, and your unwavering commitment to making them sharper every single day. I remember standing in his office, the view of the city sprawling out behind his massive desk. He had just finished a call with one of our biggest clients, and he was laughing, not a happy laugh. It was a mean, dismissive chuckle as he tossed his phone onto the polished wood. "They're so desperate," he said, shaking his head, without even looking at me. "They'll sign anything if you just make them feel important for 5 minutes. They're all the same, just numbers on a spreadsheet at the end of the day." That was his attitude. Clients weren't partners, they weren't collaborators, they were interchangeable revenue streams, a necessary nuisance that funded his new cars and his vacation home. I'd see him look at a client's name on a call sheet and not even recall what industry they were in. It was just a dollar amount to him. I saw it happen over and over. There was the time with Mrs. Chen from the organic skincare line. She was so passionate about her products, a real artisan. She'd been with the company for years. She called in a panic because a packaging error had led to a small but significant batch of mislabeled products going out. It was our fault. Our logistics team had messed up the SKU numbers. I drafted a full crisis plan, a recall, a personal apology, a discount on the next order. I brought it to him. He skimmed it and scoffed. "We're not doing all that," he said. "Just send the standard. We regret the inconvenience." Email template. Offer them 10% off their next purchase. They'll forget about it in a week. I argued. I told him Mrs. Chen had built that business from her kitchen, that this was a huge deal to her. He just looked at me with this condescending smile. "You're too emotional, you get attached, that's your weakness. This is business, they're all replaceable." The first year was brutal. You hear about the long hours, and it's true. But it was a different kind of tired. It was a fulfilling exhaustion. We started small, just me and one other person I'd poached from a competitor who believed in the vision. We applied every lesson I'd learned from the old company's failures. We were agile. We listened to clients. We focused on results, not on rigid, outdated processes. I went back to my desk and called Mrs. Chen personally. I didn't just send the template. I apologized for 20 minutes. I told her we would cover the cost of the entire recall. I spent my own weekend helping her team coordinate the communication to her customers. I treated it like it was my own business on the line, because to me, it was my reputation was tied to my work. That was my approach. I built genuine relationships. I remembered their kids' names, their anniversaries, their anxieties about the market. I answered emails at 10 o'clock at night. I became their trusted advisor, not just their account manager. They knew I would fight for them internally. He noticed, of course. He called me into his office again. "After the quarterly review, the numbers on your accounts are strong," he admitted, tapping the report. "But you're spending too much time handholding. You're making us look needy. These clients aren't loyal to you. They're loyal to this brand, to this company, to me. They see the logo on the invoice, not your signature. Y'all never make it in this business thinking you're their friend. Y'all never make it without this machine behind you, without me." I'll never forget the way he said it. "Y'all never make it without me." It wasn't advice. It was a declaration, a belief in his own invincibility. and my insignificance. That was the final straw, the chasm between how he saw the world and how I saw it was too wide to cross. I couldn't be the face of a company that treated the people who paid our salaries with such contempt. A few weeks later, I handed in my resignation. The first few days of freedom were terrifying. I had a small savings, a laptop, and a head full of ideas. I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to design a website, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. And then my phone rang. It was Mrs. Chen. "I heard you left," she said, her voice full of concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" We talked for an hour. I was honest. I told her I couldn't work in an environment that didn't value its clients. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, you have your first client. Draw up a contract. We're coming with you." I thought it was a fluke, a kind gesture. But the next day my phone rang again. It was the director of the tech startup we'd just onboarded, then the nonprofit foundation, then the boutique hotel chain. One by one they called. They'd heard through the grapevine. They'd gotten a mass email from my old boss, introducing their new account manager, and they'd picked up the phone to find me. The reason was always the same. They were explicit about it. "We're not loyal to the company," they said. "We're loyal to you. We trust you. We know y'all actually listen to us." They were voting with their feet. They were actively choosing to leave the security of an established firm for a 1% operation run out of a home office. They were betting on integrity over infrastructure. My old boss was right about one thing. They saw the logo. But he was wrong about which one. The logo they trusted was my name. My new business didn't just launch, it launched with a roster of premier clients that any established agency would envy. They weren't just clients, they were my founding partners. They gave me feedback on my pricing model. They referred me to their contacts. They were invested in my success because they felt like they were a part of it. From day one, the philosophy was simple, non-negotiable. Every single decision, big or small, had to be made with the client's best interest at the forefront. If a project wasn't a good fit for a client, I told them, even if it meant turning down money. If I made a mistake, I admitted it immediately and outlined the steps to fix it. No excuses. Transparency was the rule. The pivotal moment was landing the Astra Corp account. They were a client my old boss had been chasing for years. He'd always try to wine and dine their executives. We came in with a completely different approach. We did our research. We presented a data-driven strategy that addressed their specific pain points. We didn't talk about our reputation, because we didn't have one yet. We talked about their future growth. The meeting was in a small modern conference room. The head of marketing listened, nodded, and the snowball effect was incredible. Satisfied clients don't just stay, they become your sales force. The boutique hotel referred the restaurant group that supplied their kitchens. The tech startup referred the venture capital firm that funded them. The business grew organically and quickly. Within a year, I had to hire my first employee, then another. We moved out of my kitchen and into a small, bright office space. Meanwhile, I'd hear whispers about my old company. They were struggling. The mass exodus of their most profitable accounts had crippled them. They tried to replace the revenue with aggressive discounts and flashy marketing. But they couldn't replace the reputation. The word was out. They didn't value their clients. They were bleeding money. I saw the for lease sign go up on their fancy downtown office building a few months later. My company, on the other hand, was growing faster than I could handle. I needed to hire a senior operations manager, someone to handle the logistical side, so I could focus on strategy. We put out a job listing. We had dozens of applicants. My HR manager, Sarah, who I'd poached from a rival firm, came into my office with a stack of resumes. She had a strange look on her face. "You are not going to believe who applied," she said, and she slid a resume to the top of the pile. It was my former boss. The cover letter was professional, polite. It outlined his experience, his familiarity with the industry. But you could read the desperation between the lines. The necessity of the situation was clear. He needed a job. The very clients he had taken for granted had evaporated. And with them, his entire business, the empire he said I could never build without him, was gone. And he was asking for a position in mine. I have to admit, I sat there for a long time just staring at his name. I thought about the cowardly fool comment from my daughter. I thought about justice and revenge and humility. Some of my clients, when they heard called me Mrs. Chen, actually laughed. She said, "Well, isn't that a turn of events? I hope you make him earn his keep." There was a sense of satisfaction from them, a feeling that the universe had corrected itself. The decision was difficult. Part of me wanted to reject him outright, to give him a taste of the dismissal he'd so freely handed out. But that would have made me just like him, petty vindictive operating, from ego not from the core principle of the business. My business was built on merit, on the belief that people can do great work when they are valued, and given a clear ethical purpose. I called him in for an interview. It was one of the most surreal experiences of my life, sitting across from him in my smaller, simpler office. He was in my chair, he was trying to maintain his composure. But the confidence was gone, the arrogance was replaced by a nervous deference. We talked. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't bring up the past. I interviewed him like any other candidate. I asked him about his approach to client management. His answers were textbook, the old corporate speak. I stopped him. Let me tell you how we operate here. I said. I laid out the client-centric philosophy. I told him that here the client is always our partner, that we succeed only when they succeed, that every email, every phone call, every report is an opportunity to reinforce that trust. Ask sharp questions. A week later, we got the call they were signing with us. That win was more than just revenue, it was validation. It proved that the new model worked, it attracted talent, people started to want to work for us. The growth after that wasn't just fast. It was sustainable. We focused on innovation, on creating a culture where people were empowered, not controlled. He listened, really listened. For probably the first time he got the job, it was the best candidate for the role on paper. And I believed in the lesson. I believed people can change. Managing him was its own education for both of us. He had to learn a whole new way of working. He had to actually listen to clients, to empathize with their problems. I assigned him to Mrs. Chen's account. It was a test for him. And for me, at first it was awkward. But she, to her credit, was professional and direct. She treated him like any other vendor. And over time I saw a change in him. The old blustering entitlement melted away, replaced by a quiet focus on doing the job well. He was learning client centricity firsthand from the very people he had once dismissed. The ultimate lesson, the one that became so clear through all of this, is that a business isn't its fancy office or its aggressive sales tactics. It isn't just a logo on a page. A business is its people and the relationships they build. It's a web of trust. He thought the brand was a shield, something that commanded loyalty by its mere existence. I learned that a brand is just a promise. And that promise is only as strong as the people who keep it. One honest conversation, one kept commitment, one act of integrity. Time. He works for me now, but in a way he works for Mrs. Chen, and for every client who gave us a chance. And so do I. That's the only thing that ever really mattered. The beginning was pure energy, just two of us in a tiny room that smelled of stale coffee and whiteboard markers. We had this shared vision, this blueprint, for a company that would actually change how people interacted with technology. It wasn't just a business plan, it was a mission. And we were the only two people who seemed to get it. He had the connections, the polished charm to walk into any boardroom and command attention. I had the architecture, the deep understanding of the code, and the systems that would make it all possible. We were a perfect match. Or so I thought. We'd work late into the night, fueled by this belief that we were building something real. We signed our partnership agreement on a napkin, first a gesture of pure trust. Before we ever had the lawyers draw up the real documents, that napkin felt more binding than any contract. But the shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It started with small things. He'd take a client call without me saying. It was just a quick introductory chat. Then he'd present my ideas in meetings as our ideas, but with a tone that suggested they were mostly his. The decisions got bigger. He leased a new office space, a flashy, expensive one downtown, without even consulting me. When I questioned it, he'd just smile and pat me on the back. We have to look the part if we're going to play the part. He'd say, you focus on building the product, let me handle the business. And I did. I kept my head down, buried in the code, trusting that the partnership we started with was still intact. I was building the very heart of the company line by line, while he was out there building his own legend. The real betrayal came during a negotiation for our Series A funding. We had a term sheet from a major venture capital firm. It was everything. We'd worked for the night. Before the final meeting, we agreed on our strategy. We were a united front. But when I walked into that conference room, the energy was different. The investors were looking at him, and he was holding court. Then he slid a revised term sheet across the table to me. The changes were significant. They gave him controlling interest. About 3 years later, my assistant put a stack of resumes on my desk. We were hiring for a senior director position. It was a competitive role. I was skimming through the applications, and a name jumped out at me. His name, my former boss. His company had struggled. It heard rumors, the industry had changed. And he clung to his old ways. Until there was nothing left to cling to, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no gloating, it was more like a profound sense of the circle closing. Diluted my equity to almost nothing. He had renegotiated behind my back, presenting it to them as a necessary restructuring to ensure strong, singular leadership. He had sold me out. He convinced them that I was a brilliant technician, but not a leader, that the company needed one captain, and that captain was him. The argument we had after that meeting was quiet and venomous. It wasn't in the office, it was in the parking garage, the echo making every word sound hollow. I told him. He had violated every principle we started with. He just looked at me completely calm and said, "This is the real world. Ideas are cheap, execution is everything, and you're a dreamer. Y'all never make it without me." He said it with such absolute conviction, like he was stating a simple, undeniable fact of physics. This platform we built, it's nothing without the business machine behind it. My machine, you can walk away with your code, but y'all drown out there on your own. And I did walk away. I took the core technology, the thing I had built with my own hands. Because the contract, the real one, thankfully protected that much, but I walked away with nothing else, no office, no staff, no clients, just a lawsuit. And those words ringing in my ears, y'all never make it without me. First year on my own was dark. It was just me in a spare bedroom, turned office. The silence was deafening. There was no hum of a server rack, no chatter from a sales team, just the sound of my own keyboard. I had to rebuild everything from the ground up, every contact, every relationship, I had to establish on my own terms. I realized that in the partnership, I had let him be the face of the company, so nobody really knew me. They knew of me, the tech guy, but they didn't know my vision. I had to learn how to sell not just the product, but the vision, my vision. It was terrifying and exhausting. I made mistakes, countless ones. I undersold, I overpromised, I stumbled through presentations. But a strange thing started to happen without him, there to reframe every idea. Without his voice dominating the conversation, my own voice got stronger. I started playing to my strengths, not the strengths of our former partnership. I focused exclusively on the engineering, on building a product that was so elegant, so robust, that it would sell itself to the right people. I stopped trying to be him. I stopped trying to be a charismatic frontman. I was just myself, detailed, passionate, and deeply knowledgeable about the work, and that authenticity started to resonate with a different kind of client. They weren't looking for flash, they were looking for substance. I also hired differently. Instead of looking for people who would fit into the old hierarchy, I looked for specialists who were better than me in their respective fields. I hired a CFO who was a genuine wizard with numbers, not just a yes-man. I hired a head of sales who believed in collaboration, not conquest. We built a team where credit was shared openly, where decisions were debated transparently. It was messier sometimes, but it was real, and I found a new rhythm. I loved the clarity of it. There was no second-guessing, no political maneuvering. It was just the work, the pure, unadulterated work of building something great. Meanwhile, I'd hear things through the industry grapevine. He had launched his own company using the shell of our old business. But without the core technology I had taken, he was playing the part perfectly. The fancy office, the big marketing, launches, the talk of disrupting markets. But the word was that his product was flawed. It was unstable. He was trying to replicate what I had built with a team of junior developers. And it was full of bugs. His strategy was the same as it always had been: dominate the. I told my assistant to schedule an interview conversation, outmarket the competition, but the product couldn't support the hype. Clients would sign on only to leave 6 months later. Frustrated, his company was stagnating. He was burning through cash trying to maintain an image that was increasingly hollow. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was succeeding specifically by avoiding everything that had poisoned our partnership. There was no credit hoarding, because I made sure everyone felt ownership. There were no unilateral decisions, because we had a culture of collaboration. My success was a direct result of creating the environment. He never allowed. My company grew steadily, profitably. We weren't the loudest in the room, but we were the most reliable. We built a reputation for integrity and excellence. His company, well, it became a cautionary tale. A mutual acquaintance called me one day. He said my former partner was in trouble, serious financial trouble. The company was on the brink of collapse. He asked if I would consider talking to him. I was hesitant, the memory of that parking garage was still sharp. But I agreed to a meeting purely as a professional courtesy. We met at a neutral coffee shop. He looked tired, the polished charm was gone, replaced by a weary tension. He didn't apologize, not directly, but he acknowledged that his approach had failed. He said his company had a handful of major clients that were about to jump ship, and that losing them would be the end. And then he said something that surprised me. He said, "You built it, you actually built what we talked about, the real thing." I went home and thought about it for a long time. Letting go of the grudge wasn't about forgiveness. It was about business. His company did have those client relationships, and despite everything he was still a formidable negotiator. He had skills my company lacked. We were strong on engineering and product, but we were light on the kind of high-level corporate deal-making that he excelled at. The purely strategic part of my brain saw an opportunity. It wasn't about giving him a second chance, it was about acquiring a set of assets that would make my company stronger. I made him an offer. It wasn't a partnership, it was a position, head of business development, reporting to my COO, and ultimately to me. The role was clearly defined. He would be responsible for securing large-scale enterprise contracts. He would have no authority over product direction, no control over financial strategy. His world would be the boardroom, and he would be our ambassador there. But the terms of any deal would be set by the team. I laid it all out in a contract: roles, responsibilities, reporting structure. It was designed to prevent every single one of the issues that had destroyed us before. He took the job. I think his pride was bruised, but his pragmatism won out. The first few months were awkward, the team was wary, and he had to adjust to not being the ultimate authority. But something interesting happened within the clear boundaries I had set. He thrived. He landed 2 of the biggest contracts in our company's history. He was freed from the burden of overall leadership, from the stress of a failing company, and he could focus on what he did best: selling a vision he actually believed in. He came in wearing a suit that was a little too formal for our office culture. He looked older, the confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous tension. The interview was in my office now, with the view he used to have. We sat across from each other. I led the conversation. I asked him about his experience, his skills, how he would handle specific challenges. I focused entirely on merit and capability. I asked him about our company culture, about collaboration and innovation. He gave answers, but they felt. Because now the product behind it was solid, he was finally able to be the frontman for something real. The resolution wasn't a sentimental reunion. We don't have deep personal conversations, we have business meetings. But there's a mutual respect now that never existed before. He sees the strength of the structure I built, and I see the value he brings to it. The company is stronger for it. Letting him go was necessary for me to find my own strength, and letting him back in on my terms was a demonstration of that strength. It showed that maturity in business isn't about holding onto past grievances. It's about making the decision that best serves the future. You're trying to build. The cowardice would have been to let my ego prevent me from taking a step that was so clearly good for the business. The courage was in building something so secure that even the person who once said it'd never make it could now have a place within it, contributing to its success. I remember the exact day. He said it. The air in his office was always cold, sterile, like a museum exhibit for a bygone era. He sat behind that massive oak desk, a monument to his own authority, and he looked at my proposal for the new project management system. He didn't just dismiss it. He held the printed pages between his thumb and forefinger like they were something unpleasant he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. His leadership was all about command and control, a top-down cascade of directives. You didn't question, you just executed. Your value was directly proportional to your tenure, your title. I was just a project lead. Then, full of what he called idealism, id suggested a collaborative platform, a way for the team to share ideas transparently, to have ownership. He saw it as a direct challenge to his hierarchy. He said my ideas undermined the chain of command, that they were naive, disrespectful even. The meeting ended with him leaning back in his leather chair, a condescending smile on his face. He said, "You have talent, I'll give you that. But you don't understand how this world works. You need structure, you need direction. Y'all never make it without me." That phrase, it wasn't just a prediction. It was a verdict, a life sentence, in his particular brand of corporate confinement. It was the ultimate dismissal, not just of my idea, but of an entire generation's way of thinking. He saw collaboration as chaos, he saw empowerment as insolence. So I left. It wasn't an easy decision. There was security there, a clear path. But the path led to a destination I didn't want to reach. I didn't just want to start another company. I wanted to build a different kind of workplace. The goal was never just profit, it was to prove that a better way was not only possible, but more effective. We built it from the ground up on a few core principles. The first was empowerment. We got rid of fixed hours and focused on outcomes. If you needed to pick up your kids or work from a coffee shop for a few hours, you did it. We trusted our people to manage their time. We implemented radical transparency. Our financials, our successes, our failures, they were all open for everyone to see. There were no secrets, only shared goals. We abolished the traditional org chart. We had teams, not departments. Leaders emerged naturally based on their expertise and their ability to inspire, not their job title. Rehearsed from a different playbook, he was trying to fit into a world he didn't fully understand anymore. The friction was palpable at first. Old habits die hard. Some people couldn't handle the freedom, they needed the structure, the rigid boxes. But for others, it was like a breath of fresh air. We became a magnet for talent, not just any talent, but the high performers, the innovators, the creatives, the people who were tired of having their best ideas stifled by layers of bureaucracy. They were the ones who had been frustrated in places just like my old company. They were drawn to the meritocracy, the chance to be heard, the respect for their work-life balance. And the results spoke for themselves. Our productivity didn't just increase, it soared. Because people were working on what they were passionate about. In a way that worked for them, creativity exploded. We were solving problems in ways our competitors couldn't even conceive of, and employee retention. It became our biggest selling point. People didn't just work here, they built their careers here, they grew with the company, they had a stake in the outcome. We were living proof that when you treat people like responsible adults, like partners, they will outperform your wildest expectations. Meanwhile, I'd hear things about my old company. The industry is a small world. The stories started to trickle out. Their best people were leaving, not just leaving, but coming to us. They couldn't attract new graduates. We were cleaning up at the college recruitment fairs. Their brand became associated with something stale, outdated. They had a huge public relations disaster when they tried to force everyone back to the office 5 days a week. Without a clear reason, the article in the business section was brutal. It cited their plummeting morale and called their model a relic of the 20th century. I can only imagine what that period was like for him, to see the company he built, the empire he ruled with such certainty, begin to crumble, to see the very methods he swore by become its liability. It must have forced a painful, fundamental reevaluation of everything he believed. The industry narrative shifted completely. Analysts no longer pointed to his company as the benchmark, they pointed to us. We were the model for the future. The shift was complete. The old way was no longer seen as strong or stable, it was seen as brittle, inefficient, a glass ceiling that kept innovation locked out. The day he called me was surreal. His voice on the phone was different. The authority was gone, replaced by a cautious, almost hesitant tone. He asked for a meeting, not in his office, but in a neutral cafe. He was candid. He admitted he'd been wrong, not just about me, but about the entire philosophy. He saw what we had built, the energy, the loyalty, the sheer results. And he realized his model was dying. He wasn't just looking for a job, he was looking for an education. Bringing him on board was the most controversial decision I've ever made. My team was skeptical. They remembered the old days, the condescension, the rigid control. But I saw an opportunity. The goal was to gloat. It was to integrate. He possessed decades of institutional knowledge, relationships, and an understanding of the industry's history that we lacked. We were agile and forward-thinking, but we could sometimes be reckless, unaware of pitfalls he had seen before. After the interview, I thought about it for a day. The easy thing would have been to reject him, to have that final petty victory. But that would have meant I hadn't learned anything. That would have meant I was still playing by his old rules. My company was built on a different principle. It was built on identifying value and potential. I saw that he still had a sharp mind for certain things. He understood a part of the market that younger employees didn't. His experience, if applied correctly, could be an asset. The new dynamic was strange. For the first few weeks, having him report to me, seeing him in our open plan office at a desk, just like everyone else's. The first time he brought me a proposal, and I had to send it back for revisions. The air was thick with the ghost of our past. But he adapted. He started to learn. He sat in on our collaborative sessions and saw how ideas were debated on their merit, not on the title of the person who suggested them. He saw how our mentorship programs worked, how we actively cultivated new leaders, instead of seeing them as threats. It became a symbiotic relationship. I gained his historical perspective, he'd point out. We tried something like that in the 90s, and here's why it failed, saving us from repeating old mistakes. And he in turn was learning adaptive leadership. He was learning to listen to value the quietest person in the room as much as the most vocal. He saw that true strength isn't in commanding obedience, but in fostering commitment. The message of all this, the core of it, is that success isn't about age, it's not about which generation you belong to, it's about the ability to learn to adapt, to be humble enough to admit when you're wrong and brave enough to change. It's about valuing people, not as resources to be managed, but as partners in a shared mission. He once told me that his greatest failure was believing that respect came from a title. Now, he understands that respect is earned through empathy, through trust, through the willingness to evolve. In the end, we both learned that making it isn't about doing it alone, or under someone's thumb. It's about building something together with everyone, including your former boss, contributing in a new and meaningful way. The conference room was quiet after everyone else had left. It was just the two of us, the scent of stale coffee and whiteboard markers hanging in the air. I was presenting my projections for the new fiscal year, and Id just laid out a plan Id spent months refining. He leaned back in his leather chair, the one at the head of the table, and gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a patronizing look. I knew well, he said, it's a passionate effort. I'll give you that. Then he stood up, patted me on the shoulder, like you would a dog that had performed a simple trick, and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, not even bothering to look back. But let's be realistic, he said, his voice casual, almost bored. You're a good lieutenant, a fantastic number two, but y'all never make it out there on your own. You need the structure I provide, you need me. The words landed with a quiet thud. They didn't ignite a fiery anger. Not at first. It was colder than that. It was a deep, settling chill. For a moment doubt flooded. In what if he was right? What if my ambition was just arrogance? What if I was only competent because I was operating inside the cage he'd built? I stood there staring at the charts Id made, at the numbers I knew were solid. And that's when the feeling shifted. The chill turned into a clear, sharp focus. The doubt became fuel. It wasn't about proving him wrong to the world, it became about proving myself right to myself. I realized his statement wasn't an assessment of my ability. It was a confession of his own fear. He needed to believe I was dependent on him. His control depended on my perceived weakness. In that moment, I saw the ceiling he had placed over my career, and I decided I would not live underneath it. I didn't hand in my resignation the next day. That would have been an emotional reaction. And this couldn't be about emotion, it had to be a campaign. The first step was absolute silence. I became the model employee. I executed his directives with efficiency. I gave no indication that anything had changed. But outside of those office walls, a different machine was starting up. I spent every evening and every weekend conducting a ruthless audit of my own skills. I identified the gaps. I knew our industry. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was stating the weather. It wasn't a threat, it was worse. It was a prediction. He believed with his whole heart. In that moment, the office didn't feel like a place of opportunity. It felt like a very nicely furnished cage. The walls seemed to close. In a little, the hum of the computer got louder, more annoying. I called him back and made him an offer. It was a senior role, but not the one he'd applied for. It was a better fit. I was clear about the boundaries. He would report to a manager. He would be part of a team. His success would be measured by his contribution to the collective goal, not by his individual authority. There was a long silence on the phone, then he accepted. His voice was quiet, inside and out from a strategic level, but there were operational details I'd been shielded from, so I learned them. I took online courses on supply chain logistics and corporate finance. I devoured books on intellectual property law and digital marketing analytics. I wasn't just learning, I was reverse engineering the entire structure of his company, identifying every single point of inefficiency, every client pain point he consistently ignored. Simultaneously, I began building a new network. I was careful, deliberate. I started attending industry conferences he never bothered with. I reached out to former colleagues who had left the company, not to complain, but to genuinely reconnect and discuss industry trends. I cultivated relationships with suppliers and middle managers at our partner firms. These weren't transactional chats. I offered them insights, shared interesting articles, built real rapport. I was building a web of contacts that existed entirely outside of his sphere of influence, a community he didn't even know was forming. And at my kitchen table late at night, I started drafting the business plan. It wasn't just a plan for a company, it was a blueprint for obsolescence. It targeted every single one of his weaknesses, where his firm was bloated and slow to adapt. Mine would be agile, where he nickel-and-dimed clients. We would offer transparent value-based pricing. I identified 3 potential angel investors, people who valued innovation over tradition, and I began the slow, discreet process of feeling them out, sharing my vision in careful, confidential conversations. The day I handed him my resignation was one of the most peaceful days of my life. There was no drama. I walked into his office, placed the letter on his desk, and simply said I was pursuing a new opportunity. He was smug, condescending. He gave me a speech about the safety of the nest and the dangers of the open sky. He was so sure it'd come crawling back in 6 months. I just smiled, shook his hand, and walked out. The launch wasn't a grand spectacle. It was me, a small rented office space. Burning determination, I hired not for prestige, but for hunger and talent. I brought on 2 young, brilliant people he had overlooked, and a seasoned operations manager he had driven away with his micromanagement. We took the blueprint and brought it to life. Our entire culture was built on a single principle: empower people to do their best work. We eliminated unnecessary layers of approval. We encouraged dissent, and debate it was the antithesis of his top-down, fear-based leadership. The pivotal moment came about 8 months, and we were pursuing a major client, one that my former company had serviced for years, but had grown increasingly frustrated with. The request for proposal was complex, demanding a level of customization my old boss would have dismissed as unprofitable. My team worked tirelessly. We didn't just answer their questions, we anticipated needs they hadn't even articulated. Yet the presentation wasn't me standing at a podium, it was a collaborative workshop. And we won the day. We got the call. The office was silent for a moment, and then erupted. That victory was more than a contract, it was validation. It proved our model worked. It attracted more talent, more investors. We grew not by chasing every dollar, but by delivering such exceptional value that our clients became our biggest advocates. We scaled carefully, always prioritizing our culture and our quality of service over rapid, reckless expansion. About 2 years later, I was reviewing applications for a senior consultant role. The market had shifted. My old company, stagnant and resistant to change, had been losing ground. Their reputation for poor client service was finally catching up with them. And there it was, his name, his resume. It was a surreal thing to see. I felt a swirl of emotions, but the strongest one was curiosity. I approved him for an interview. Sitting across from him in the interview room was a profound experience. The dynamic had completely flipped. He was trying to project confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight unease in his eyes. The conversation was entirely focused on the present and the future. I asked him about his adaptability, his approach to collaborative problem-solving, his thoughts on the industry's direction. I asked him about a time he had failed and what he had learned from it. He answered, but his answers felt rehearsed, rooted in an old way of thinking. He was still selling himself as. He started the following Monday. The first few weeks were awkward for him. Mostly, he was navigating a hierarchy where he was no longer at the top. But something happened. Freed from the pressure of being the ultimate decision-maker, he started to contribute in ways I hadn't anticipated. He became a valuable mentor to some of the younger staff. He brought a depth of historical knowledge that was useful. The lesson wasn't about a role reversal for the sake of revenge. The lesson was demonstrated every day. The authoritative boss, when the role required a humble team player. After the interview, I discussed it with my leadership team. They knew the history. We evaluated him purely on his merits, on what he could bring to the company. Today, the consensus was that his experience was valuable, but his attitude was a potential risk to our culture. Yet I saw something else. I saw a man who was capable of learning. The lesson wouldn't be in rejecting him. The lesson would be in offering him a chance to grow. I called him myself to make the offer. It wasn't the senior role he'd applied for. It was a lead position, one step down, with a clear path for advancement based on performance. I laid out the terms with absolute clarity. He would be part of a team. He would be expected to mentor younger colleagues and be open to feedback himself. His success would be measured by the success of those around him. There would be no special treatment and no lingering resentment. The past was the past. His value to us started today. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. I could almost hear his pride wrestling with his reality. Finally, He accepted the true victory wasn't in the title change or the reversed hierarchy. It was witnessed a few months later. I was walking through the office and saw him in a conference room standing at a whiteboard, not dominating the conversation, but listening intently to a junior analyst half his age. He was nodding. And then he added a suggestion that built on her idea. He was learning, he was contributing, he was finally part of something that was about building people up, not keeping them in their place. That was the real strategic comeback. It demonstrated that the most powerful success isn't achieved by crushing the competition, but by creating a system so strong and so fair that even your former detractors can find a place to succeed within it. The prophecy wasn't just broken, it was replaced with a new, more generous truth. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens after 5 on a Friday. Id waited for that moment for everyone else to pack up and leave. I remember the sound of my own heels on the polished concrete floor echoing way too loud in the empty space. His office was at the end of the hall, the glass walls all dark, except for that one rectangle of light. I could see him in there on the phone, leaning back in that big chair. Id practiced what I was going to say all week. I had the numbers memorized. Knew my value to the team, to the company. I was ready to articulate it. I thought it was a formality. I thought he'd see it too. I knocked. He waved me in without looking up, finishing his call. I stood there feeling like a school kid outside the principal's office when he finally hung up. He didn't offer me a seat, so I just started. I laid it all out. The projects Id led to completion, the revenue Id brought in, the clients Id managed. I talked about my growth and my commitment. I finally got to the point, the ask for a promotion, a real title, a salary that matched the work I was already doing. He listened, but he wasn't really hearing me. He was just waiting for me to stop talking. Then he leaned forward, put his elbows on his desk, and gave me this look. It wasn't anger, it was worse, it was pity. And he said, "You know, I've always liked your enthusiasm, it's cute. But let's be realistic here." That's when the floor started to feel like it was tilting. "You're a good worker, you follow instructions, but you don't have the vision, you don't have the guts. This industry, it eats people like you for breakfast." He leaned back again, a dismissive little smile on his face. "The truth is, y'all never make it without me, not in a million years. This company, this position, it's the best you're ever going to get. You should be grateful for that." In how the company operated, true success isn't about holding people down to make yourself feel bigger. It's about creating a structure where people can build each other up, where their success is your success. He works for me now, but more importantly, he works within a system that proves his original prophecy completely, utterly wrong. The words didn't just hang in the air, they physically hit me. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I felt my face get hot. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. A dull, throbbing sound, worthlessness. That was the first wave. It washed over me, this icy cold feeling that maybe he was right, maybe I had been deluding myself. All that confidence, all that preparation, it just crumbled into dust right there. And then right behind it came the anger, a hot, sharp anger that he had the power to make me feel so small that he could dismiss years of my life, my ambition, with a single sentence. But the anger was trapped underneath the shock. I just stood there frozen. I think I mumbled something, an "I see" or a "thank you for your time." I turned around and walked out. My composure lasted until I got to the elevator. The doors closed, and I leaned against the wall, my whole body trembling. The seed was planted. He meant it to be a seed of doubt, something that would keep me in my place. But it immediately felt different. It felt like a challenge, a dare. The hurt was so profound, so deep, that it had nowhere to go but to transform. By the time I reached the ground floor, the numbness was gone, replaced by a single clear, burning thought: I am going to prove you wrong. The next Monday, I gave my notice. He seemed almost amused. He wished me luck in that condescending tone. Sure, I'd be back. That was the fuel for the first year. That conversation was my engine. I'd work until 2 in the morning, my eyes burning from staring at the screen. And I'd hear his voice: "Y'all never make it without me." And I'd make another pot of coffee. I sacrificed everything. Weekends became just 2 extra workdays, birthdays, holidays. They were all just deadlines in disguise. I lived on takeout and anxiety. My apartment was a mess of papers and prototypes. The solitude was immense. There was no team, no office chatter, just me, and the 4 walls, and the ghost of his words. And the doubt was always there, a constant whisper. The first time a big client said no, it screamed at me. When the numbers weren't adding up, when I had to dip into my savings just to keep the lights on, his voice was right there. "See, I told you you don't have what it takes." There were nights I'd just sit on the floor and cry feeling the weight of it all. I was so tired. But I had one friend, Sarah, she'd call me every Sunday night. She never talked about the business. Unless I brought it up, she'd just talk about normal things, about her dog, about a movie she saw. She'd listen. When I was on the verge of quitting, she never gave me pep talks. She just reminded me that I was still a person separate from this all-consuming mission. She was the anchor that kept me from drifting away completely. The emotional cost was huge. I felt like I'd aged 5 years. In one, the stress was a constant knot in my shoulders. But the fire was still burning. It had to. I had nothing else. The turning point was so quiet, so undramatic. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my home office, which was really just a glorified corner of my living room. An email popped up. It was from a client, a big one we'd been chasing for months. The subject line was just agreement. I opened it, my hands shaking. It was a signed contract, a real multi-year contract that would not only keep us afloat, but allow us to actually hire people to grow. I read it 3 times. Then I just put my head down on the desk. I didn't cheer, I didn't cry, I just felt this silence, a deep, profound relief. The pressure that had been crushing my chest for years just evaporated. It was done. We had done it. I had done it. The pride came later, the first time we were written up in a major industry publication. I allowed myself to feel it, a sense of vindication that was so sweet it was almost painful. It wasn't about revenge. Not anymore. It was about validation, my validation of myself. I had looked into the abyss of his prediction and clawed my way out. The public recognition was nice, sure, awards, speaking engagements. But the real victory was internal. It was the quiet knowledge that I had been right about my own. The office was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that only happens after everyone else has gone home. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across my desk. I'd prepared for this meeting for weeks, spreadsheets, projections, a list of my contributions to the team's biggest wins. I was nervous, sure. But mostly, I was hopeful. I thought I was about to get a raise, maybe even a promotion. I thought he would finally see my value. Capabilities all along. About 3 years in, we were hiring for a senior position. HR sent over a stack of applications. I was going through them, mostly skimming. And then I saw his name. I actually laughed out loud at first. It had to be a mistake, or a different person with the same name. But it was him. The resume was his, the employment history was his, the company he'd told me I'd never survive without it had downsized, his role was eliminated. And here he was applying for a job at my company, reporting to me. The emotional whiplash was intense. My heart started pounding all over again. Old anger bubbled up. A part of me, a small petty part, wanted to print out his application and frame it, but a bigger part just felt stunned. I brought him in for an interview. I had to. He was on paper qualified. Seeing him walk into the conference room was one of the strangest experiences of my life. He was different. The swagger was gone. He looked older, tired. He tried to maintain that same confident demeanor, but it was thin, fragile. When he sat down across from me, there was a moment of pure awkward silence. I could see him processing it. The power dynamic had completely flipped. I was in the big chair now. I asked him the standard questions. He answered them well, professionally, but his eyes kept flickering away from mine. He was nervous. I realized in that moment that his cruelty hadn't come from a place of strength. It had come from a place of fear. He was afraid of people like me, people with ambition, because we threatened his own precarious position. His statement, "Y'all never make it without me," was a confession. It was about his own terror of being irrelevant. I hired him. It surprised everyone, including myself. But it wasn't an act of charity. And it certainly wasn't a setup for some revenge plot. He was good at the job. I had to separate the personal history from the professional need. It was difficult. Every time I had to give him feedback, I'd feel a flicker of that old hurt. But I made a conscious decision to treat him with the respect I never received. I was firm, but fair. I judged his work, not our past. Over time, we found a new rhythm. He became a valuable member of the team. He never mentioned our past conversation. I never brought it up, but one day, about a year after he started, we were working late on a project. It was just the two of us in the office. He looked up from his laptop and said, "You know, I was wrong about you." That was all. No grand apology, just a simple, stark admission. And I nodded. I said, "I know," and that was it. That was the closure. The role reversal was never about him working for me. It was about me finally working for myself. It was about understanding that his limitations didn't have to be mine. Managing him taught me more about leadership than anything else. It taught me that real power isn't about belittling others. To feel big, it's about creating an environment where people can succeed, even the people who once doubted you. His fear created a cage for me for a little while. But my perseverance built something he never could. Door, and I held it open for him too, that more than any signed contract or industry award felt like the real victory. The circle was complete, not with a bang, but with a quiet understanding in a half-empty office, long after the sun had gone down. You know, when I first started at the old company, I thought he was a giant, a titan of the industry, my boss. He had this enormous corner office, the fancy car, the respecter, at least the fear of everyone in the building. I was just grateful for the opportunity. I thought I had so much to learn from him. He was leaning back in his chair, looking out the window at the city below. He didn't even look at my folder. I started talking, my voice maybe a little too eager, laying out my case. I got about 3 sentences in when he held up a hand to stop me. He finally turned and looked at me, and his expression wasn't dismissive or angry, it was worse, it was pitying. And I did learn, just not the lessons he intended to teach me. The first thing I learned was the mantra. It was his answer to everything. This is how it's always been done. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a belief system, a religion. And he was its high priest. We'd be in a meeting, and I'd see a problem clear as day, a process that took 10 steps, but could be done in 2, a customer complaint that highlighted a fundamental flaw in our service. I'd raise my hand tentatively and suggest a small change. He'd just smile, this patronizing smile. He'd lean back in his leather chair and say, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you don't understand the nuances. This industry runs on tradition, on relationships. We have a model that works, and that was the end of it, the model, this sacred, untouchable model that was in reality crumbling from the inside out. The flaws weren't hidden, they were everywhere. We used software that was older than I was. It took us a week to generate a report that any modern system could spit out in seconds. Our customer service was a nightmare, a labyrinth of phone trees and department transfers. Clients were frustrated. They felt ignored, they were just entries in a ledger, numbers on a spreadsheet. And the worst part, nobody seemed to care. As long as the quarterly numbers were acceptable, the boss was happy. It was all about maintaining the status quo, about not rocking the boat. I remember the specific moment it clicked for me. We lost a huge client, a client we'd had for 20 years. They didn't even give us a reason. They just left. My boss was furious, ranting about their disloyalty. But I had spoken to their project manager a month earlier. He'd told me quietly that they were exhausted, that we were slow, expensive, and resistant to any kind of collaboration. He said it felt like pulling teeth to get a simple update. I took that feedback to my boss. I said, this is a warning sign. We need to be more agile, more transparent. We need to listen. He looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. There ain't just one client. He said, the model is sound, y'all. See, you need to have a longer-term perspective. That's when I realized it wasn't just a flawed system, it was a sinking ship. And the captain was insisting we were still sailing smoothly. The entire industry was operating this way, and it was ripe for disruption. It was vulnerable. It was begging for someone to come along with a fresh idea and a willingness to actually listen. So I started dreaming, not out of anger at first, but out of a kind of necessity. I had to believe there was a better way. The core idea was simple, almost laughably simple. What if we built a company that actually put the customer first, not as a slogan, but as an operating system? What if we used technology not as a necessary evil, but as our greatest asset? What if we were fast, transparent, and collaborative by design? I spent my evenings and weekends architecting it. I mapped out every single point of friction I'd seen in the old company and designed a solution. Instead of a single monolithic software system, we'd use a suite of integrated cloud-based tools. Everything would be in real time. Instead of hiding information, we'd share it openly with our clients. They'd have a dashboard where they could see the status of their project anytime. Instead of long formal reporting cycles, we'd have brief daily check-ins. He said, look, I appreciate your enthusiasm, I really do. But let's be realistic. He leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. You have a good work ethic, you're reliable. But that spark, that instinct, it's just not there in this industry. You need more than just effort, you need a certain ruthlessness, a killer instinct. And frankly, he said, and this is the part that I can still hear word for word, y'all never make it without me. This company, my guidance, it's the only thing keeping you afloat. I knew I couldn't do it alone. I started talking to people carefully. I'd have coffee with colleagues who I knew were also frustrated, the brilliant data analyst who was tired of her insights being ignored, the young developer who was constantly shot down. When he suggested a new tool, we were a network of discontent, a shadow team of innovators trapped in a legacy system. One by one they agreed, they saw the vision, they were tired of working for something they didn't believe in. We were going to build something we could be proud of. The prototype was crude, we built it in my garage after hours. But it worked, it demonstrated the principle we could do in hours. What took the old company days, we could provide a level of insight and control that was unimaginable in the old model. It was tangible proof that a better way wasn't just possible, it was already here. Launching was terrifying. We had no safety net, we quit our jobs on the same day. Our strategy was surgical. We didn't try to compete with the old company for its biggest, most loyal clients. They were a lost cause, too entrenched in the old ways. Instead, we targeted their weakest links, the clients who were clearly unhappy, the ones on the verge of leaving. We didn't just send them a brochure, we gave them a live demo of our platform. We showed them what transparency and speed actually looked like. The first domino fell almost immediately. It was a small client one the old company had always treated as insignificant. They signed with us after a single meeting. And they were thrilled. They told their friends were competitors of ours in other fields. Word of mouth is a powerful thing. When you genuinely deliver a superior experience, it's not marketing, it's validation. The growth wasn't just rapid, it was exponential. Within a year, we were a legitimate threat. Within 2, we were the company to watch. The old guard's reaction was exactly what we expected. First, there was denial. My old boss gave an interview to a trade magazine calling us a flash in the pan. He said we didn't understand the relationship-based nature of the business. Then, when we kept growing, there was imitation. They tried to copy our dashboard, they tried to promise faster turnaround times. But facade, you can't just slap a new coat of paint on a broken engine. Their culture was still rooted in the old way. Their attempts to copy us came off as desperate and hollow. They failed because they didn't understand the philosophy behind the technology. It wasn't about the software, it was about a whole new way of thinking. The shift was incredible to watch. Industry publications started writing about us. As the new benchmark speakers at conferences cited our methods, we were no longer the disruptors, we were the leaders, the standard that others were trying to meet. I'll never forget the day I saw the email. It was from a recruiter, but the name in the body of the text was my old boss. The subject line was something generic. But the message was clear, his company was struggling. They'd had massive layoffs, they were losing market share every quarter, and he was looking for a new opportunity. The recruiter asked if we had any senior roles available. The irony was so thick you could taste it. I didn't respond out of spite, I actually thought about it. I discussed it with my team. The consensus was surprising. They said we should talk to him not to gloat, but to see if there was value there. His knowledge of the industry was deep, even if his application of it was outdated. So I agreed to an interview. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The words didn't just feel like a criticism, they felt like a diagnosis, a final verdict on my entire potential. My face went hot, then cold. I remember my fingers gripping the edge of the chair, trying to anchor my self-worthlessness. That was the first wave, a crushing feeling. That he was right, that he'd seen some fundamental flaw in me, that I'd been blind to. Then came the anger, a sharp, bright heat, that made me want to stand up and shout, but it was. Sitting across from him in our bright open-plan office was surreal. The power dynamic had completely flipped. He was in a suit that looked a little too big for him. Now, he was trying to project confidence. But I could see the nervousness in his eyes. The man who had once told me I'd never make it without him was now asking me for a job. We talked for an hour. He laid out his experience, his contacts, and for the first time, I heard a hint of humility. He acknowledged, without saying it directly, that the world had changed, that the model he had worshipped was obsolete. He said he was eager to learn a new way of working. We ended up offering him a position, not a senior leadership role, that wouldn't have been fair to the team that had built this company from the ground up. We offered him a role as a senior advisor, a subject matter expert. His value was his historical knowledge, his understanding of the legacy systems we were replacing. We could integrate that deep industry context into our agile framework. Real validation wasn't in hiring him, it was in watching him adapt. It took time, old habits die hard. But he started to see the power of our methods. He saw how happy our clients were, he saw how empowered our employees were. He became, in a way, a convert. He's still with us, and he's valuable. But the lesson was etched into that entire experience. Tenure doesn't equal wisdom. Experience alone isn't a substitute for innovation. The true currency of leadership isn't how long you've been game, it's your ability to see the game is changing, and to have the courage to change with it to build a new table, instead of fighting for a seat at the old broken one. He once said, "I'd never make it without him." He was right, but not in the way he meant. I made it precisely because I was without him. I made it because I was free to build something better. I remember the first time I walked into that office. The floors were too shiny, the kind of polished concrete that reflected the harsh overhead lights, and made the whole place feel like a surgical theater. Everyone moved quickly, heads down, but there was a nervous energy in the air. It wasn't the buzz of productivity, it was the hum of anxiety. My boss David called it the real world. He'd lean back in his enormous leather chair and tell me, "This is just business, kid. You don't get a gold star for playing nice." His motto was simple: profit first, people second. And the people were always a distant second. I saw him pressure the accounting team to creatively interpret expense reports, to push bills to the next quarter, just to make our numbers look a tiny bit better. I heard him on the phone with clients making promises I knew we couldn't keep, using jargon to obscure the fact that we were selling them a solution we hadn't fully built. My job was in client strategy, which quickly became a lesson in managed disappointment. I was the one who had to translate David's overblown promises into a realistic plan, and I was always the one left facing the client when those promises inevitably fell short. I'd sit in meetings, my stomach in a knot, as David would smile and agree to impossible deadlines. The moment the client left, his smile would vanish. "Just figure it out," he'd say to me. "That's what we pay you for, make it work." The breaking point came with the Ethelred account. It was a small family-owned manufacturing company. They weren't our biggest client, but they were the best kind. They were decent, paid on time, and trusted us completely. David decided we needed to push a new expensive software suite on them. It was a product I knew was full of bugs, practically still in beta. I told him it wasn't ready, that it would disrupt their entire operation. Immediately smothered by confusion, was this a test? Was he trying to motivate me in some twisted way? I looked at him, waiting for a smile, a signal that it was a joke, but there was nothing, just this calm, settled certainty in his eyes. He just laughed. "It's ready enough for their check to clear. Their old system is outdated anyway. Well, be doing them a favor in the long run." I argued that it was dishonest, that we were setting them up for failure. He stood up, his face turning a shade of red. "Id come to dread." He leaned across his desk, his voice low and cold. "You have a lot of high-minded ideas for someone with so little experience. You think you can succeed in this business with that attitude, with this naive morality. Let me be clear, you will never make it without me. You need someone like me to show you how the world really works out there on your own, with your precious principles. You'll be eaten alive." That was it. The line had been drawn, not just in the sand, but in concrete. I couldn't cross back over to his side. I handed in my resignation the next morning. Starting my own firm was terrifying. The fear of failure was a constant companion, but it was quieter than the shame I felt working for David. My mission was simple, almost laughably simple. In a cutthroat industry, do good work, be transparent, and treat people with respect. I wrote a one-page manifesto. It wasn't a complex business plan filled with market projections. It was a list of promises we would never promise. What we couldn't deliver, we would be upfront about. Costs with no hidden fees. We would fire clients who were abusive to our staff, and we would always prioritize the client's actual success over a quick sale. The first year was a test of that resolve. I had to turn down a huge contract from a venture capital firm because their business model was predatory. I remember hanging up the phone after saying no, my hands shaking, looking at my dwindling bank account. I had to explain to a potential hire why we couldn't match the salary offer from a competitor, but I could offer them a strict 40-hour work week, genuine respect, and a clear conscience. Some of them took the other job. I didn't blame them. But slowly something started to happen. The clients we did have, the small ones, the ones we treated fairly, they started to talk. They referred other business owners who were tired of being lied to. They said things like, "It's just so refreshing to work with someone who tells me the truth, even when it's not what I want to hear." We built our reputation one honest conversation at a time. It wasn't a marketing campaign, it was just who we were. We attracted a different kind of employee too, not the hotshots looking to make a fast million, but brilliant, thoughtful people who were exhausted by the toxic cultures they'd left behind. They were innovators and problem solvers who wanted to focus on their work, not office politics. Our team was smaller, but it was solid. It was built on trust. About 3 years in, we landed the Orion Global account. They were a massive player, the kind of client that could transform a business later. I asked their CEO why he chose us over the bigger, more established firms. He said, "I did my due diligence. I called every one of your clients. Do you know what every single one of them said? They said you were honest. They said, when you made a mistake, you admitted it immediately and fixed it without charging extra. That's a level of integrity I can't buy anywhere else." That's priceless. That contract allowed us to grow, but it was growth on our own terms. We won an industry award for ethical practice, not because we applied for it, but because our clients nominated us. I don't even remember what I said in response, probably some mumbled agreement. A quiet "I understand." I walked out of that office, down the hall, into the elevator, and out through the lobby like a ghost. The city sounds were just a dull roar. His voice was on a loop in my head. "Y'all never make it without me." It was a seed, and it planted itself deep. For days I fought it. I'd list my accomplishments to myself. In the shower I'd try to summon the anger again, to use it as a shield, but the doubt kept creeping. Meanwhile, I'd hear whispers about my old company. David had doubled down on his aggressive tactics. He'd taken on shady investors, made even riskier promises. There was a lawsuit from a client alleging fraud. The good people I'd worked with had all jumped ship. The company's reputation was in tatters. It was collapsing under the weight of its own compromises. One rainy Tuesday, my assistant said there was a man named David here to see me. I wasn't prepared for the sight of him. The swagger was gone. His suit was expensive, but looked loose on him. He stood in the doorway of my office, a space I'd designed to be warm and open, full of natural light, and he seemed smaller somehow. He sat down and didn't make eye contact for a full minute. He finally said, "I guess you heard." I nodded. He let out a long, shaky breath. "Turns out you can't build a lasting business on a foundation of lies." Who knew? He tried to smile, but it was a sad, broken thing. "My company is finished. The board forced me out. I have liabilities." He looked at me then, and his eyes were full of a humiliation I never thought I'd see. I was wrong about everything. I thought being ruthless was being strong. I thought ethics were for people who couldn't win. I see now that I was the coward, taking the easy, dishonest path. He asked if there was any place for him here, even in a junior role. He said he needed to learn how to do things the right way. I thought about all the times he'd belittled me, all the corners he'd cut the trust, he'd broken the easy thing. The satisfying thing would have been to say no, to give him a taste of his own medicine. But that would have meant his way had won. That would have meant I'd learned nothing. I offered him a position as a senior consultant, with a clear set of boundaries. He would have no authority over hiring or finances. He would report to a manager, who was half his age. His role would be to use his experience, his knowledge of the industry, but within the strict confines of our ethical guidelines. It wasn't a gesture of pure forgiveness, it was a business decision, but one rooted in the principle of redemption. We were a company that believed people could grow. He took the job. It was awkward at first, and there were times I saw the old arrogance flicker. But the structure of the company kept it in check. He's been with us for a year now. He's not the same man. He recently told me that coming to work every day, without having to look over his shoulder, without having to remember which lie he told to whom, was like a weight being lifted. He's become one of our most valuable mentors to the younger staff, teaching them not what to do, but what not to do. The ultimate triumph wasn't in seeing him fail. It wasn't about revenge. The triumph was in proving that the harder path, the path of integrity, is actually the strongest path. It's the only path that lasts. David thought ethical leadership was a weakness. He thought it would hold you back. But I built something he never could. I built something real. And in the end, the very principles he mocked became the foundation of the only place that would give him a second chance. That's the real competitive advantage. It's not about being better than everyone else. It's about building something better, something that doesn't just create wealth, but creates dignity. And that is a success that no market crash can ever take away. The office had a certain smell: old coffee, stale printer toner, and this faint, sweet scent of complacency. It was the smell of a place that had stopped evolving. And in the center of it all was David, my boss. He had a big, heavy wooden desk, always perfectly clean, except for his old, bulky computer monitor, and a framed photo of a sailboat. He loved that boat. He talked about it more than he talked about the work. Back in what if he was right? What if my confidence was just naivete? David was a gatekeeper, that's the only word for it. His entire value was tied to a system. He built 15 years ago a system that was, to be frank, falling apart at the seams. It was held together with digital duct tape and desperate prayers. But to David, it was his masterpiece, his fortress, and the knowledge of how it worked, or more accurately how to make it look like it was working, was his sole currency. I remember being so eager when I started. I'd come in with ideas I'd read about online, new automation, scripts, different project management tools. I'd say, "David, what if we tried this? It could save us dozens of hours." A month he'd lean back in his leather chair, the one that groaned under his weight, and he'd give me this patient, pitying smile. "We've always done it this way," he'd say. "This system is proven. You don't fix what isn't broken." But it was broken. Everyone knew it. We were just wasting time, pretending it wasn't. The moment it crystallized for me was during my annual review. I'd pushed hard that year, implementing little fixes, where I could, trying to learn the new programming languages that were becoming standard in our industry. David had the review forms printed out paper. He tapped his pen on the section about future goals. He said, "You need to focus less on the flashy new stuff, and more on mastering the fundamentals of this business, the business we're actually in." Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping into this confidential tone, like he was letting me in on a big secret. "The truth is," he said, "this industry is built on relationships, on knowledge. You can't just Google y'all, never make it in this business without me." It wasn't said with malice. That was the worst part. It was said with absolute, unshakable conviction. He genuinely believed that his outdated, crumbling kingdom was the entire world. And in that moment, I saw him clearly. He wasn't a mentor. He was a monument to a way of working that was already extinct. He was the bottleneck. And he was proud of it. I knew then I had to leave not just the company but his entire mindset. So I mapped out exactly what our industry was moving toward. It was all about cloud architecture, AI-driven data analysis, and seamless API integrations. Everything. David's old system was not. I identified the gap. It was a chasm, really, between what we were doing and what the market demanded. The next 6 months were a blur. I lived on my couch with my laptop. I spent every evening and every weekend on online learning platforms. I wasn't just watching videos. I was getting certified. I got a cloud architect certification, then a DevOps certification. I built a portfolio from scratch. I didn't just do tutorial projects. I rebuilt our entire company's clunky system from the ground up, but properly, efficiently, on a modern cloud platform. It was my secret project. I'd use it to apply for freelance gigs. And I started taking on small contracts on the side. At first, it was just fixing other people's messes, problems that looked a lot like the ones I faced every day at the office. But with my new skills, I could solve them in hours instead of weeks. The word started to get around. I built a profile on a few professional networks. I started writing short articles about the problems I was solving. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was building a brand, a tiny reputation. But it was. My first feeling was a hot rush of anger. It was right there in my chest. I wanted to argue. I wanted to list every success, every client I'd brought in, every system I'd improved. But the anger cooled down almost as fast as it came. It turned into something else, a cold, hard clarity. I looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't about my limitations. This was about his need for control, his belief that his way was the only way. That prophecy wasn't about my future, it was about his own. The turning point came about a week later. I was in a meeting taking notes, and he repeated one of my ideas back to the group as his own, and everyone nodded, praising his insight. And in that moment, the hurt didn't transform into more sadness. It crystallized. It became something hard and sharp, and determined. The desire to prove him wrong wasn't just a vague wish anymore. It was a mission. It was the only thing that made sense. Mine. It was based on what I could actually do, not on who I knew, or how long I'd been sitting at a desk. The turning point was a client from one of those freelance gigs. They were a mid-sized company, and they were impressed with how quickly I'd untangled their data pipeline. They asked if I could handle a much larger project, a complete digital transformation. The budget they mentioned was more than my annual salary at David's company. I remember staring at the email, my heart hammering in my chest. This was it. The market was speaking, and it was speaking a language I had taught myself. I gave my notice the next week. David was amused. He gave me that same pitying smile. "The grass isn't always greener," he said, shaking my hand. This is a tough business, y'all see. I didn't argue, I just packed my things and walked out of that stale-smelling office for the last time. The demand was immediate. It was like opening a floodgate. That first big client led to 2 more referrals. Within 3 months, I was turning down work. I wasn't just a freelancer anymore. I was a specialist. I hired my first employee, a brilliant young developer I met through an online forum. Then another. We became a small, focused consultancy. We didn't do everything. We did one thing exceptionally well: modernizing legacy systems. And the irony was our best source of leads was David's industry. His clients, they'd hear about us, see the work we were doing for their competitors, and they'd call me. They'd bypass David's company entirely because they knew his approach was a dead end. He was becoming obsolete, and his own clients were making it happen. About a year and a half after I left, I got an email. It was from David. His tone was different, formal, hesitant. He said he'd been following our company's growth and congratulated me on our success. Then he got to the point his company was struggling. They'd lost several key accounts. He wondered if we might have a brief consultation call. I agreed. We got on a video call. He looked older, tired. The confident, patronizing tone was gone. He explained his situation. His technical lead had left, and he couldn't find anyone who understood his unique system. I listened then. I said, David, the problem isn't finding someone who understands your system. The problem is that your system is the anchor that's sinking you. You need to replace it. There was a long silence. He knew I was right. Then he asked the question I never thought I'd hear. Do you think would there be a place for someone with my experience at your firm? I had to think about it. It wasn't about revenge. It was about value. What value did he actually bring? He knew the industry history. He had relationships, though many had frayed. He understood the business problems our clients faced. Even if he couldn't solve them with modern tools, he could be a bridge between the old world and the new one we were building. We brought him in for an interview. It was one of the most surreal experiences of my life, sitting across a table from him. But this time, I was behind the big desk. He was in the applicant's chair. We talked about the role. It was for a client relations manager. He'd be the face of the company for some of our older, more traditional clients. But he'd report to my head of project management. He would be the one explaining our processes to clients, not the other way around. He would have to learn. The next 2 years were a blur of caffeine and exhaustion. I'd come home from my job and immediately start working on my own plans at the kitchen table. There were so many late nights. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in the room. I sacrificed weekends, holidays, time with friends. Every time I felt tired, every time I wanted to quit. I'd hear his voice, y'all never make it. And it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The anger was my fuel. The need for vindication was my compass. Use our project management software. He would have to defer to the technical expertise of the team he used to oversee. I saw him struggle with it. His pride was a physical thing in the room, but he needed the job. He accepted the offer. It's been 6 months since he started. It's not always easy. Sometimes he slips back into his old patronizing manner. Hell, make a suggestion about how we should handle a project, and I have to gently but firmly remind him of our workflow. He has to listen to developers half his age explain complex technical concepts to him, but he's trying. He's learning. The other day we were in a meeting with a major client. David started to explain a concept using his old convoluted terminology. I stepped in and rephrased it using clear modern language. The client immediately understood. David looked at me, and for a second I saw it in his eyes, not resentment, not anger. It was a kind of sad, dawning respect. He just nodded slowly and said, yes, that's a much better way to put it. The power didn't come from the title on my door. It didn't come from being his boss. It came from the skills, the relentless, specific, market-valued skills I had acquired in the end. His statement was inverted. He couldn't make it without the new knowledge. I possessed the real lesson, the one I live every day, is that there are no more gatekeepers. There is only the gate, and you hold the key to it yourself. If you're willing to continuously learn, to adapt, to outgrow the very walls that once seemed to contain you, your value is never determined by someone else's approval. It's determined by what you can actually do. I saw it happen again and again. He would sit in his big leather chair, leaning back with a smug little smile, and talk about our clients like they were cattle. They need us more than we need them. He'd say, if one walks, 3 more will show up next week. They're all just revenue streams, interchangeable. I'd just sit there, my pen frozen over my notepad, feeling this cold knot tighten in my stomach. These were people. They had businesses, dreams, pressures. we couldn't even imagine, and he saw them as numbers. Quarterly report. I remember one meeting so clearly. It was with a woman named Sarah, who ran a small family-owned manufacturing company. She'd been a client for years. She was explaining a cash flow issue, asking if we could possibly restructure the payment schedule for a big project, just for a quarter. She was so earnest, so transparent about her books. My boss listened with this fake patient smile. And then he said, "Sarah, the terms are the terms. This isn't a charity. If you can't manage your finances, that's a you problem, not an us problem." I saw her face just fall, the hope drained right out of her. He didn't even look at her. He was already typing an email on his phone. I stayed behind. After he strode out of the conference room, I poured her a fresh cup of coffee and said, "Let's look at the numbers again. There's got to be a way." We found a solution. It took me an extra 20 hours of work that I didn't bill her, for that was the chasm for him. It was about extracting maximum value with minimum effort. For me, it was. There were moments, of course, when the doubt won, when a potential client said no, when a deal fell through at the last minute. His voice would come back not as a memory, but as a taunt. "See, I told you you don't have it." I'd lie awake at night, my heart pounding, wondering if I was just a fool on a path to a very public failure. But I had a few people who kept me going. My partner, who never once questioned the late hours, a former colleague, who became a mentor, who saw the vision and believed in it when I about building something that lasted. I built real relationships. I remembered their kids' names. I asked about their vacations. I stayed up late troubleshooting problems that weren't even my direct responsibility. Because if it was their problem, it was now my problem too. It was about partnership, trust. He called it coddling. He pulled me into his office one afternoon after a particularly successful client review. He said, "You're a great account manager, but you're too soft. You think these people are your friends. They're not. They're loyal. This brand to this company, to me, they're loyal to the machine. You're just a friendly face they see on the way in. Y'all never make it in this business on your own. You don't have the killer instinct. You need this structure. You need me." The day I finally handed in my resignation was one of the most terrifying days of my life. I had no plan, no backup, just a savings account that wouldn't last 3 months, and a profound sense that I couldn't breathe in that place anymore. I was prepared for silence. I was prepared to start from absolute zero, maybe wait tables, while I tried to get a single client to take a chance on my new non-existent firm. The calls started the next morning. It was Sarah, the manufacturing client. She said, "I heard you left. I'm not surprised. Are you starting your own thing? Because if we're coming with you, our contract with them is up next month, and we won't be renewing." Then it was Mark from the tech startup. Finally, he said, "I was wondering how long you'd put up with that guy. Send over your new service agreement as soon as you have a letterhead." Then David, then Angela, one after another. They weren't just offering sympathy, they were moving their business. They were handing me a foundation. They explicitly told me, "We're not loyal to the logo on the door. We're loyal to you, to your integrity, to the way you actually listen." So my new company launched not with a whimper, but with a roar. We opened our doors with a roster of premier clients that my old boss would have killed to keep. It was a revolution led entirely by the very people he had dismissed as irrelevant. They voted with their feet, they voted with their invoices, and they left his office eerily quiet. From day one, the philosophy was simple, non-negotiable. Every single decision, big or small, had to be made with one question in mind. Is this truly in the client's best interest? If a project wasn't a good fit for us, we'd refer them to someone who could do it better. We were transparent about our pricing, our processes, our mistakes. We celebrated their wins as if they were our own. And the effect was like a snowball rolling down a mountain. Sarah referred 2 other business owners from her networking group. Mark's startup had a huge exit, and his first call was to recommend us to the acquiring company. We grew organically, steadily, built on a foundation of genuine trust. Meanwhile, I'd hear snippets about the old firm. The buzz in the industry was that they were struggling. The interchangeable clients weren't lining up to replace the ones who left. The revenue streams dried up. The brand loyalty he was so proud of evaporated the moment the person actually providing the service was gone. The machine broke down without a heart. Struggled to. They were the antidote to the poison. They were the ones who reminded me of my own capability when I couldn't see it myself. About 18 months in, we were swamped. The business was growing faster than I could handle alone. I needed to hire. I put out an ad for a senior consultant. I told my team, We would look at every applicant based purely on merit, on their skills, on their potential. To embrace our culture, I meant it. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for competence. His application came in on a Tuesday afternoon. The name jumped off the screen. His resume was lean gaps, where there hadn't been gaps before. The list of recent accomplishments was thin. He was clearly desperate. The collapse of his company had been more total than Id realized. The very clients he took for granted had been the pillars holding up his entire operation. And when they walked away, the whole thing came down. His application was a necessity, an act of survival. I decided to bring him in for an interview. The news got around to some of my clients. Before he even arrived, Sarah called me. She didn't tell me what to do, but she said, "You know, the poetic justice of that man having to answer to you of him. Finally learning what real client service looks like. It's pretty satisfying. It confirms every reason we chose to follow you." Her words stuck with me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was a validation of the entire principle we'd built our company on. Interview was surreal. He sat where clients used to sit, but now he was on the other side of the desk. He tried to maintain some of his old bluster, but it was hollow. The confidence was gone. He talked about market conditions and industry shifts. I let him talk. Then I leaned forward. I said, "It wasn't the market, it was the people you lost, Sarah and Mark and David. Why do you think that was?" He couldn't meet my eyes. He muttered something about client turnover, and I laid it out for him, not with anger but with a calm, direct clarity. Id learned from running my own ship. They left because they weren't respected. They left because they felt like transactions. They came here because we treat them like partners. That's the only killer instinct that matters in the long run. I offered him the job. It was a junior position with a probationary period. I made the terms clear. He would report to a team lead who was a decade younger than him. He would be directly serving the clients he once dismissed. He had to accept that new dynamic completely, or the door was right there. He swallowed his pride and accepted. I think it was the first truly humble act I'd ever seen from him. Watching him learn was the final lesson for both of us. He saw firsthand what it meant to have a client call you at 8 p.m. not with a complaint, but with an exciting idea, because they see you as part of their inner circle. He saw that the soft skills he mocked were actually the steel framework of a sustainable business. The ultimate lesson, the one that hangs in the air every day in our office, is so simple. A business isn't a logo, or a brand guide, or a fancy office. It's the sum of the trust you build person by person, conversation by conversation. It's the people and the relationships. Everything else is just furniture. And he who used to own the building was now learning how to build something real, one honest connection at a time. Let me tell you about the day the ground fell out from under me. It was a Tuesday. I think rain was spattering against the glass wall of our office. The one we'd signed the lease for just 6 months earlier, laughing like kids who'd gotten away with something. Our names were on the door, side by side, equal partners. That was the pact. We built this agency from a shared idea, a shared frustration with the way things were always done. He had the charm, the network, the silver tongue that could talk investors into anything. I had the strategy, the operational mind, the ability to see the entire chessboard 3 moves ahead. We were the perfect team, or so I thought. The emotional cost was real. The stress was a constant hum in the background of my life. I became shorter with people I loved. I was constantly preoccupied. I was building something from nothing, and the weight of that, combined with the weight of needing to prove a point, was immense. It wasn't a healthy drive, it was a desperate one. But it was the only way I knew how to do it. The shift was so gradual, I almost didn't notice it. At first it was little things. He'd take a client call by himself and say it was just a casual check-in. He'd present my business plan to the board and use I instead of we'd let it slide. We were friends, partners. I trusted him. But then the little things got bigger. He hired a junior account manager. Without consulting me, he started making financial commitments that strapped our cash flow, promising clients the moon to secure their business, leaving me to figure out how we'd actually deliver it. Every time I'd try to pull him aside to realign, he'd just clap me on the back. "We're building an empire here," he'd say. "Don't get bogged down in the details." But the details were the entire foundation of the business. He was building a facade, and I was the one pouring the concrete to keep it from collapsing. The breaking point was the Grayson account. It was our biggest client, our golden ticket. I'd spent 3 months developing a new digital engagement strategy for them, working nights and weekends. The presentation was mine top to bottom. The day before the final meeting, he called me, said he'd handle the presentation solo. that the Grayson CEO preferred a more streamlined conversation. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. But I agreed foolishly. I agreed the next day. He walked out of that meeting. Grayson had not only signed on for the new strategy, they'd committed to a 50% increase in their retainer. I was ecstatic. Until I saw the contract amendment. He emailed me, my name wasn't on it. The primary contact, the signatory, was just him. He'd gone behind my back and renegotiated the entire deal, cutting me out of the direct relationship, making himself the sole face of the account. I confronted him in his office. The rain was still coming down. I laid it all out, the slow erosion of trust, the unilateral decisions. And now this, the Grayson contract. He didn't even deny it. He just leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the one he bought for himself without asking. And he looked at me with this cold, pitying smile. You don't get it, do you? He said, this business runs on relationships. My relationships, the ideas are good, sure. But without my name, my connections, you're just a guy. Whiteboard, you're talented, I'll give you that. But y'all never make it without me. Those words, they didn't just hang in the air, they carved themselves into me. Y'all never make it without me. It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict. And in that moment, I knew the partnership was dead. I walked out that day. I left my name on the door, and everything else I started from zero. The first year was brutal. I worked from my kitchen table. The silence was deafening. No sales calls, no brainstorming sessions, just me and my laptop. I was starting over at 40 with a reputation that was now tied to a very public, very messy split. He was right about one thing: he had the network. And he used it. He spread the word that I was difficult, that I didn't understand the client side of things, that my departure was the best thing that ever happened to our old agency. I had to build new network from scratch, one person at a time. I focused on what I was good at, the deep analytical work. I stopped trying to be the charismatic frontman. I became a specialist. I took on projects other agencies thought were too complex, too niche. I worked with clients who cared more about results than flattery. I learned to hire for my weaknesses. My first hire wasn't a salesperson, it was a meticulous project manager who could keep the trains running on time. My second was a sharp young creative who understood data visualization better than anyone I'd ever met. I built a team not of stars, but of craftsmen. We were quiet, efficient, and devastatingly effective. And something funny happened. I found a rhythm I'd never had before: the freedom to make a decision without a debate, to set a strategy without it being second-guessed, to build a culture based on mutual respect and clear roles. It was liberating. The business was smaller, but it was solid. It was mine. The first real sign that it was all going to work wasn't a massive contract or a huge payout. It was quieter than that. It was a quarterly report. I was looking at the numbers. And for the first time, the projections I had drawn up on that kitchen table weren't just hopeful guesses. They were being met, exceeded. Even the business was profitable. It was sustainable. It was real. I remember sitting there staring at the screen. And the feeling wasn't a loud celebration. It was a profound, deep silence, a quiet. Meanwhile, I'd hear things about my old company. The Empire. He'd hired a team of big personalities, all flash, no substance. They were chasing every trend, overpromising, underdelivering. The Grayson account, they lost it after a year. Because the strategy I'd built was never properly implemented. The cracks I'd been holding together for years finally split wide open. His business, built on the illusion of his singular genius, began to crumble. The irony was so thick you could taste it. He failed precisely because he refused to acknowledge that a business is an ecosystem, not a one-man show. He was proving my point with every client he lost. And my little company, the one I built from my kitchen table, started to grow steadily, organically. We weren't making headlines, but we were making a profit. We were earning a reputation for reliability and intelligence, the kind of reputation that lasts. About 3 years after the split, I got a call. It was from a headhunter. They said they had a candidate for a senior director role, someone with a lot of experience in our space, but whose recent venture hadn't panned out. The name was my former partner's. I listened, my hand tight around the phone. The headhunter was pitching him to me. The sheer unbelievable irony of it was almost too much to process. I didn't say yes right away. I thought about it. For a long time I thought about the betrayal, the words he'd said, the anger I'd carried for so long. But I also thought about business. He was still brilliant in a room. He could still open doors that were closed to me. His failure, had I hoped, humbled him, taught him a lesson I never could have. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about assets. I called him myself. The conversation was awkward, strained. I laid it out, pure business. I told him The company had grown, we needed a director of business development, someone to lead our client-facing strategy. The role reported to me, there would be no partnership, no equity, no ambiguity. He would have a clear set of goals, a defined territory, and he would be part of a team, not above it. I told him, it was a job, a very good one. But it was a job with a boss. And that boss was me. There was long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his pride fighting with his desperation. Finally, he said, I understand the terms. He took the job. The first few months were difficult. The old dynamics tried to resurface. He'd try to go around processes, make promises to clients, without checking with the project team. Each time I'd pull him into my office and we'd have a very direct, very calm conversation about boundaries, about the structure that made this company work. And slowly something changed. He saw the machine I'd built. He saw how the project managers executed flawlessly, how the creatives delivered work that was not only beautiful but effective, how the entire operation hummed with a quiet confidence. He started to respect it. He started to contribute to it, instead of trying to dominate it. He learned to use his skills within the framework. It wasn't a friendship, we'll never be friends again, the trust we had is gone forever. But we've found something else, something more valuable in its own way, a professional respect. He does his job. And he does it well. He brings in business that I couldn't, and my team delivers on it, in a way his old company never could. It's a symbiotic relationship. Now, not a parasitic one. Letting go of the grudge wasn't an act of weakness. It was the ultimate power move. It meant the past no longer had a hold on me. I was able to look at him, not as the man who betrayed me, but as a resource, and in doing that I proved once, and for all that his final words to me were wrong, I didn't just make it without him. I ended up building a company strong enough to hire him. Wave of relief that washed over me, the tightness in my chest that I had carried for 2 years just loosened. Then came the pride, a clean-earned pride that was entirely my own. It wasn't about him anymore, it was about what I had built. You remember that office, don't you? The one on the 20th floor with the heavy mahogany doors and the thick carpet that swallowed every sound. It always felt like a tomb, a very expensive, very quiet tomb. And he ruled from inside it. His leadership style wasn't just top-down. It was imperial, a command control structure, so rigid you could feel it in the air. Your value wasn't measured by your ideas, but by your tenure, your title, your willingness to nod and say yes, sir. It'd come in buzzing with an idea, something we could do to streamline a process, to connect better with a new market. It'd lay it out, the data, the potential, and he'd sit there in that big leather chair, not even looking at the screen. He'd be looking at me, and he'd listen. But not to understand he was listening for flaws, for insubordination. He'd lean back and say something like, that's not how we do things here, or you're skipping steps. You have to earn the right to think like that. It was a system designed to preserve itself, to keep everything exactly as it was. The friction was constant. It was in the way a meeting would stall, because he needed to be the one to give the final insignificant approval. It was in the way he'd dismiss a younger team member's suggestion with a patronizing chuckle. He saw collaboration as a committee, a weakness. He saw empowerment as a loss of his own power. And my ideas, the ones that focused on transparency, on trusting the team, on actual innovation, he saw them as naive, disrespectful, even a challenge to his authority built over 30 years. The breaking point was the quarterly review. I'd just presented a plan to shift our team to a more agile, project-based structure. I showed him the metrics from the pilot group, the spike in engagement, the faster turnaround times. He listened stone-faced. Then, he pushed the report back across the desk. He said, you have talent, I'll give you that. But you're reckless, you don't understand how this world works. You're building a house on sand. He stood up, walked to the window looking down at the city, and he said it. The words were so calm, so utterly convinced. The truth is, y'all never make it without me. This company, this industry, it eats idealists for breakfast. You need my name. You need my structure. Without it, you're just noise. And for a moment, I believed him. The weight of that office, the silence, his absolute certainty, it pressed down on me. But then I looked around. I saw the faces of my colleagues, brilliant people, who were slowly having their passion drained away by this very system. And I knew right then that he was wrong. It wasn't about making it in his world. It was about building a new one. So I left. It wasn't an angry storm out. It was a quiet, determined exit. The goal wasn't just to start a competing company for profit. It was a mission to build a better way to work, a place where the value was in the work itself, not in the hierarchy above it. We started small, just a handful of us, in a rented loft space, with exposed brick, and too much coffee, but the principles were there from day one. We implemented flexible work hours not as a perk, but as a statement of trust. We said we care about your output, not the hours you sit in a chair. We established radical transparency. Everyone from the newest intern to the most senior developer knew our runway, our challenges, our successes. There were no secret budgets or closed-door strategy sessions. We shared ownership literally through a stock option plan that meant everyone had a stake in the outcome. Disagreement wasn't just tolerated, it was. The real validation came a few months later at an industry conference. I was there as a speaker, not an attendee. I talked about my company's approach. And afterward, people lined up to ask questions. A journalist from a major publication wanted an interview later that evening. At a reception, I received an award for innovation. As I stood on that stage, holding that piece of glass, I looked out at the crowd. And for a fleeting second, I allowed myself to feel the full circle of it from being told id. Encouraged WED have these intense, passionate debates about product direction, and the best idea won regardless of who proposed it. There was no single boss to appease. And you know what happened? We became a magnet. Word got out not through expensive recruiters, but through the people who worked there talking to their friends. We started attracting top talent, the real high-performers who were frustrated with the old-fashioned political workplaces, the kind of people who didn't want to wait 10 years to have their voice heard. They came for the culture, and they stayed because they were empowered. The results were undeniable. Our productivity was through the roof, because people were working on what they believed in, not what they were ordered to do. Creativity exploded. We were innovating at a pace that the old company couldn't even comprehend. And employee retention, we barely even thought about it. People didn't leave because they felt valued, they felt seen, they felt like they were building something together. The model wasn't just nice, it was effective, profitably, sustainably effective. Meanwhile, we'd hear things about the old company. The gossip mill in the industry is small. They were bleeding talent, not just any talent, but their best young minds, the people who were the future. They couldn't attract new graduates. Our company was the one featured in the campus magazines. They started making public relations missteps, trying to launch products that felt dated and out of touch, because they were designed by committee, by fear. Their stock price began to stagnate. The empire was showing cracks. I heard through a mutual contact that my old boss was struggling. He couldn't understand why the old formulas weren't working anymore, why loyalty seemed to have evaporated. He saw our success, our growth, our buzz in the industry. And I think it forced a painful, profound reevaluation. The world was shifting, and the rules he had mastered were becoming obsolete. The industry narrative flipped. Where once his company was the stalwart, the benchmark, now analysts and media outlets began to cite company as the model for the future of work. They wrote articles about our flat structure, our focus on culture. The shift was complete. The old way, his way, was no longer seen as strong and stable. It was seen as what it was: brittle, inefficient, and utterly incapable of adapting. About 2 years after I left, I got an email. It was from him. His tone was different, formal, but not arrogant. He asked if we could meet for coffee, not in his office, but in a neutral, quiet cafe. I agreed. He looked older. The unshakable confidence was gone, replaced by a kind of weary curiosity. We made small talk for a few minutes, but it was awkward. Then he got to the point. He said, "I've been watching what you've built. It's impressive." He struggled with the word. "I misjudged you. I thought your ideas were soft. I see now that they're anything." But he took a long sip of coffee. "My role at the company has been restructured." He was essentially being phased out. The board wanted new blood. He wasn't ready to retire, but the industry, he knew, had moved on without him. And then he asked the question, "I never thought I'd here. I was wondering if you might have a place for someone with my experience." The hire was a big decision. It wasn't about pity, it was a calculated move. He possessed decades of institutional knowledge, a network of contacts, and a deep understanding of the industry's history that we lacked. But the dynamic was clear from the start. He would report to me. His role was as a senior advisor, a contributor, not a commander. Never make it to being recognized for having made something new. It was a sense of justice. But it was a quiet, personal justice. The trophy was just a symbol. The real victory was the quiet knowledge I carried inside. The first few months were educational for both of us. He had to learn modern management techniques. He sat in on meetings where an intern would challenge my idea, and I'd actually engage with them, debate the merits. He saw me admit I was wrong in front of the whole team. That was a foreign concept to him. He was learning adaptive leadership in real time. He was learning that authority isn't given by a title, it's earned through respect. And I learned from him, too. He'd pull me aside and give me historical perspective. We tried something like that in 2005. He'd say, and here's why it failed. His knowledge helped us avoid pitfalls we wouldn't have even seen coming. It became a symbiotic relationship. I gained wisdom. He gained a new way of being. The real moment of integration was during a major product launch. We were under immense pressure. He was leading a task force, and he fell back into his old habits. He started micromanaging, issuing commands, shutting down discussion. The energy on the team plummeted. I had to pull him into my office. It was an uncomfortable conversation. I said, the way you're leading that team is undermining their talent. You're not trusting them. You need to step back and facilitate, not dictate. I saw the flash of the old boss in his eyes, the instinct to push back. But then it faded. He nodded. He said, you're right, old habits. And he went back out, apologized to the team, and changed his approach. The turnaround was immediate. That was the moment I knew we'd truly succeeded, not just as a company, but in this experiment. The message of all this, the real heart of it, is that success isn't about age. It's not about whether you're from the old guard or the new school. It's about the ability to learn to adapt, to value people over hierarchy. He thought my empathy was a weakness, but it turned out to be our greatest strength. It built a culture that could withstand anything. And in the end, the person who said I'd never make it without him, well, he found his place not as my boss, but as my colleague, and in a way that's a much more powerful victory. About a year after that, we were hiring for a new senior position. My HR manager handed me a stack of applications. I was flipping through them, mostly skimming, when a name and a resume stopped me cold. It was my former boss. The company he'd said was his lifeblood had downsized, and his role was eliminated. There was his entire career, summarized on 3 pages, ending with his recent departure. And now he was applying for a job at my company, reporting to me. Fear of being irrelevant. I just nodded. I didn't say a word. I took the folder with my proposal back from his desk. And in that silence, the decision was made. The fuel was lit. The feeling was incredibly complex. There was a shock, of course, then a flash of that old anger, that desire for vindication. It would have been so easy, so satisfying in a childish way, to just discard the application. But that feeling passed quickly, replaced by something heavier, a sense of the strange symmetry of life. The emotional complexity was overwhelming. This wasn't a revenge fantasy come to life. It was a real person with a family needing a job. When he came in for the interview, the dynamic was surreal. He was in the same chair I had sat in years before, but the power had completely reversed. He was nervous. I could see it in the way he held his coffee cup. A slight tremble. I made a conscious decision before he walked in. I would set aside the personal history. This was a professional assessment. I asked him about his experience, his skills, his vision for the role. He was good. He was still sharp, still knowledgeable. The interview was respectful. I treated him with the same professional courtesy I would extend to any candidate. And in doing that, I started to understand something. His words to me all those years ago, they weren't really about my limitations, they were about his own. He needed to believe I was dependent on him. It justified his position, his authority. His statement was a reflection of his own fear of being irrelevant, of being surpassed. He was projecting his own insecurities onto me. Seeing him there vulnerable, I felt a surprising sense of empathy, not pity, but a genuine understanding of the fear that can drive people to say cruel things. We offered him the position. He accepted. The first few weeks were awkward for everyone, I think, but we settled into a new normal. I treated him with respect, and he, to his credit, did the work. He was competent, diligent. The past wasn't erased, but it was put aside. It had to be. The closure didn't come from a dramatic confrontation. It didn't come from me lording my success over him. It came quietly over time. It came from seeing him succeed in his new role, and realizing that my journey wasn't about proving him wrong to the world. It was about proving myself right to myself. The role reversal became strangely a circle of professional growth for both of us. He had to learn to follow, and I had to learn to lead with empathy, not with the ghost of my old resentment. The moment he said those words was a wound, but now it's just a scar, a reminder of where I've been and how far I've come. I remember my first day at the old company. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy like a library for a subject. No one wanted to study anymore. My boss. He had this way of talking. He'd lean back in his big leather chair and say, son, this industry runs on relationships. It's not about being faster or smarter, it's about who you know and how things have always been done. He treated the established way of doing things like it was a sacred text. Any suggestion, any tiny idea for improvement was met with this patient condescending smile. He'd say, we've tried that before, or the clients aren't ready for that. It was a system built on comfort, not excellence. I didn't hand in my resignation the next day. That would have been emotional, reckless. This had to be different. This had to be strategic. The moment he said those words, I started drafting a new kind of project plan, the exit strategy. It was all in my head at first, then in a private digital notebook he'd never see. And the flaws were everywhere. You just had to open your eyes. We used software that was older than some of the interns. Customer service was an afterthought, a department you called only when something was already on fire. The entire process was slow, cumbersome, and expensive. It was like watching people use a horse and buggy on a highway. I'd see the frustration in our clients' eyes during meetings. They'd ask simple questions about efficiency or transparency, and we'd give them these long, convoluted answers. That basically boiled down to this is just how it is. I tried at first, I really did. I put together presentations. I showed him data on how we could cut delivery times in half with some basic automation. I found case studies of similar companies that had modernized and were thriving. He'd listen, he'd nod. And then he'd say those words that became a mantra in that place. Y'all never make it without me. You don't understand the nuances. This business is built on my reputation. He thought the foundation was solid because he had built it, but I see the cracks. The foundation wasn't just cracked. It was turning to dust. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It was a slow dawning. This system wasn't just flawed, it was a sitting duck. It was so focused on preserving the past that it was completely blind to the future. And the future was coming whether he liked it or not. I just decided I would be the one to bring it. So I started building in the evenings in my apartment, after everyone was asleep. It wasn't about rebellion at first. It was about proving to myself that a better way was possible. The core idea was simple, almost stupidly simple. What if we put the customer at the absolute center of every single decision, not as an abstract concept, but as a practical guide? What if we used technology not as a fancy add-on, but as the backbone of the entire operation? What if we were agile, adaptable, and actually listened to what people needed? I didn't want to just fix the old model. I wanted to build a new one from the ground up, a model based on transparency, speed, and genuine value. I mapped out every single point of friction I had seen in the old company. Every delay, every unnecessary step, every moment of confusion for the client. I designed the new system to eliminate all of it. It was like designing a racetrack after only ever driving on dirt roads. Then came the team. I reached out to a few people from the old company. Not the yes men, not the ones who were comfortable. I reached out to the frustrated ones. The woman in accounting who had been begging for a better invoicing system. The guy in logistics who had sketched out a more efficient routing plan on a napkin. They were the best in the business, but they were suffocating. They saw the same flaws I did. We started meeting on weekends. It was this little secret society of innovators huddled around my kitchen table, fueled by coffee and a shared belief that things could be better. The energy was electric. It was the exact opposite of that heavy quiet in the old office. We built a prototype, a minimum viable product. It was rough around the edges, but it worked. It demonstrated the core idea with such clarity. We could show a potential client exactly how much time and money they would save in real numbers. The superiority wasn't just a claim, it was demonstrable. Seeing it work for the first time, that was the moment I knew this wasn't just a side project. This was the future. The first part was skill acquisition. I took a hard look at our company. What were we weak at? Where did we constantly hit roadblocks? Digital marketing was one. The old school methods were failing. So I signed up for courses, not just introductory stuff. I went deep. I got certifications in data analytics, in SEO, in social media algorithms. I became the expert in the room on things the company didn't even know it needed. Our launch strategy was surgical. We didn't try to take on the whole market. At once we targeted the old company's most dissatisfied clients. The ones who had been vocal about their frustrations. We went to them. And we didn't just give a sales pitch, we gave them a demonstration. We showed them our platform side by side with the old way of doing things. The difference was so stark. It was almost embarrassing. We offered a free trial, a no-risk chance to experience the difference. We had nothing to lose. And everything to prove. The domino effect was incredible. It wasn't us doing the selling after a while. It was our clients. They'd tell their business partners. They'd post about it in industry forums. The growth was organic, driven by sheer results. We were solving problems. They had just learned to live with. The word of mouth was our most powerful marketing tool. We were focused on delivering such a good experience that our customers became our advocates. I heard about the old guard's reaction, of course. At first it was denial. My old boss told people it was a fad, that we didn't have the staying power then. When we started taking significant market share, it shifted to attempts to copy us. They'd roll out a new improved service that was just a cheap imitation of our model. But they couldn't copy the culture, they couldn't copy the underlying philosophy. Their attempts felt hollow, because they were just slapping new paint on a broken-down car. The engine was still the same. They failed because you can't innovate from a place of fear. You can only innovate from a place of vision. Within 2 years, the shift was undeniable. Industry publications started writing about us as the ones to watch. Then, as the new benchmark, the conversation changed. It was no longer about how things had always been done. It was about how we were doing them. People started asking, how would they handle this? The old company was no longer the reference point. We were. I'll never forget the day I got the call. It was a headhunter. But not for me. They said my old boss was looking for a new position. His company was struggling. They'd lost over 60% of their market share. Key people, the talented ones he'd taken for granted, had left. The inflexibility of his model had finally caught up with him. The industry had moved on, and he had stayed behind. The headhunter asked if I might know of any opportunities for him. The irony was so thick you could taste it. A few weeks later, I received an email directly from him. It was polite, professional, but you could read the humility between the lines. He asked if we could talk. We met for coffee. He looked older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a weary pragmatism. He acknowledged right there that the new way, our way, was the only way to survive. He wasn't asking for his old job back. He was asking for a place, any place on the team. He needed a job. The decision to hire him wasn't about revenge. It was a logical one. He had decades of experience. He knew the industry's history inside and out. That knowledge had value if it could be aligned with a new culture. We brought him on as a senior advisor. His role was to provide context, to help us navigate the legacy aspects of the business that we had deliberately avoided. But he reported to a team lead half his age. He had to adapt to our systems, our pace, our way of thinking. Integrating him was a delicate process. We had to value his experience without letting it resurrect the old defeated mindset. It was a lesson for everyone. It sent a clear message to the entire company. Tenure alone doesn't grant you authority. Contribution does. Innovation does. The willingness to learn and adapt is the true currency of leadership. He had to learn that he had to sit in meetings where his suggestions were questioned by young engineers, not out of disrespect, but because we tested every. The second part was networking. I was careful. I started attending industry conferences my boss thought were a waste of time. I'd use vacation days. If I had to, I didn't talk about leaving. I just talked about ideas. I connected with people on LinkedIn, had coffee with potential partners. I built a web of contacts that existed completely outside of his sphere of influence. These weren't just names in a phone book. These were relationships, people who knew my work, my ethics, separate from the company's name. Idea on its merits, not on the title of the person who suggested it. Sometimes I see him at his desk, working on a project for a client he would have considered small potatoes in the old days. And I think about what he said to me all those years ago. Y'all never make it without me. He was wrong. But in a way he was also right. I didn't make it with the version of him that was stuck in the past. I made it by building something that made that version obsolete. And in the end, the only way for his knowledge to have any future value was for him to join the company that had rendered his old one irrelevant. The ultimate validation wasn't beating him. It was building something so much better that he had no choice but to become a part of it. The air in that office always felt thick, not with ambition, but with something else, a constant low-grade anxiety. You could smell it in the stale coffee and the scent of toner from the overworked printer. My old boss, David, had a way of moving through the space that just set the tone. A little too slick, a little too sure of himself. He had this mantra he'd repeat whenever we were in a meeting with a client, or just huddled around someone's desk. Perception is reality, he'd say. And what that really meant was that the truth was flexible. It was something to be managed, to be shaped into whatever was most convenient for closing the deal. I remember this one time we were pitching a new software platform to a mid-sized family-owned business. Their current system was a mess, and they were vulnerable. David knew it during the demo. He oversold the capabilities, he promised features that were still in beta, glossing over the bugs, as if they were minor quirks. He looked those people right in the eye and told them the integration would be seamless, knowing full well it would be a nightmare for their IT guy, a nightmare we'd charge them extra to fix later after they left. Buzzing with excitement, I went into his office. I said, "David, we can't promise them that the stability isn't there, yet we'll be setting them up for failure." He just leaned back in his leather chair and gave me this patronizing smile. "This is just business," he said. "Everyone does it. They need to hear what will get them to sign. We'll figure out the details later." And that was the culture compromise, little white lies that weren't so white, prioritizing the quick win over the right thing. My paycheck felt heavier every month, weighed down by that compromise. The breaking point was the Anderson account, a sweet older couple who'd poured their life savings into a small chain of bakeries. They needed a new inventory system. David saw them as easy marks. He structured a contract with hidden fees, automatic renewals they couldn't get out of, and support charges that were borderline predatory. I fought him on it. I said, "We were taking advantage of people who trusted us." That's when he said it. He stood up, his face red, and he jabbed a finger at me. "You think you're a better than this? You think you can survive out there with your precious morals? You're a naive. Y'all never make it without me. This city will eat you alive." The words hung in the air. They weren't just an insult, they were a challenge. And in that moment, I knew I had to take it. I quit that afternoon. And the third part, the most secret part, was the business plan. At night after work, I'd open my laptop. I drafted everything: the financial projections, the service offerings, the ideal client profile. I identified the exact gaps in the market that my old company was too slow, too arrogant to fill. I knew I needed backing, but I couldn't go to the usual suspects. They were all his friends. I found an angel investor through my new network, a quiet, sharp woman who liked my methodical approach. So I started from scratch, just me, a laptop, and a very clear idea of what I didn't want to be. The mission was to be the biggest or the richest. It was to be the most trustworthy. I called the company Anchor Solutions. The name was intentional. I wanted to be a stable, reliable force in a chaotic market. The foundation was integrity. It had to be. We wrote our ethical guidelines before we even had our first client. They were non-negotiable: full transparency in pressing, no fine print, no surprises. Absolute honesty about what our products could and could not do. We would rather lose a contract than mislead someone. And we did. We lost a few big ones early on. I'd come home to my wife and tell her we'd turned down a $50,000 deal because the potential client wanted us to fudge the data in their reports. She'd just nod and say, "Then, it wasn't our deal." It was terrifying. There were months where I wondered if David had been right. But slowly something started to happen. We built a reputation not through flashy marketing, but through word of mouth. A client would tell another business owner, "You know, I finally found a company that doesn't treat me like an idiot. They tell me the truth, even when it's not what I want to hear." That kind of endorsement is priceless. We became the antidote to the Davids of the world. People were tired of the games. They were exhausted from constantly having to be on guard, deciphering contracts, waiting for the other shoe to drop. They craved a partner they could actually trust. The reward wasn't just in the revenue, though the business became profitable. It was in the quality of everything. The clients we attracted were fantastic. They were collaborative, they valued long-term relationships, and they paid their bills on time because they felt respected. And then the talent started to come. Really good people, brilliant engineers and designers, started leaving the big corporate firms to join us. They'd say the same thing in their interviews: "I am tired of being asked to cut corners. I want to build things." I am proud of our company. Culture became our biggest asset. We didn't have a ping-pong table or a fancy espresso machine. We had respect, we had clear expectations. People felt safe to innovate, to speak up when they saw a problem. That kind of environment attracts the best people. We started winning industry awards for corporate responsibility, which was nice. But the real prize was the stability. Our growth was steady, organic. It was built on a foundation of rock, not sand. We didn't have the dramatic peaks, but we never had the terrifying valleys either. I heard rumors about David's company over the years, a client lawsuit here, a key employee departure there. The perception he loved to manipulate eventually caught up with him. The reality was that his business was a house of cards. It all came crashing down last year, a major scandal involving fraudulent billing practices. The company collapsed almost overnight. I didn't feel happy about it. It just felt inevitable. About 3 months ago, my assistant said there was a David Miller here to see me. I didn't even know he was in the building. I told her to send him in. He looked older, a lot older. The slick confidence was gone, replaced by a kind of weary shuffling. He sat down in the chair across from my desk, the same kind of chair he used to sit in. He didn't make eye contact for a long time. He just talked about the industry, how tough it was. And then he finally said it. I made a lot of mistakes. I thought being tough was the same thing as being smart. I was wrong. He asked if there was a place for him here, not a leadership role. He wasn't asking for that, just a chance to do good work, to be part of something that wasn't toxic. Few meetings. She believed in the plan. The initial funding was secured discreetly. For months, I lived a double life. The loyal employee by day, the architect of my own future by night. It was exhausting, but every small step felt like a quiet victory. I thought about it for a long moment. I thought about that day in his office. I thought about the cowardly fool he said I was. And I realized that true strength isn't about refusing to forgive, it's about having the confidence to offer a second chance. But on your own terms. I offered him a position as a senior project manager. It's a good job. But it has very clear boundaries. He reports to someone else. He adheres to our ethical guidelines, which are non-negotiable. There's no room for the old way of doing things here. He took the job, and he's actually been doing well. He seems lighter. He's learning. The moral of the story isn't about revenge. It's not a tale of the student surpassing the master. It's simpler than that. It's proof that ethical leadership isn't a weakness or a naive fantasy. It's the ultimate competitive advantage. Because when you build something with integrity, you attract people who value it. Clients and employees alike. You build something that lasts, and sometimes you even get to help someone find their way back. I remember the day I went to his office excited. Id found a new way to automate one of our most tedious reporting tasks. It would have saved the team dozens of hours, a month. I laid it out for him. The logic, the efficiency. He leaned back in his big leather chair, didn't even look at my screen. He just smiled, this thin, condescending smile. He said, "That's cute, but we have a system that works. This business, it's built on relationships, on institutional knowledge. It's not about these little tech tricks." Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping like he was sharing a secret. "You're a good, but you have a lot to learn. The truth is, in this industry, y'all never make it without me." And I believed him for a while. I really did. He had been a legend. Once people would tell stories about his early days, his big deals. His office was a shrine to a past era, with framed magazine covers and signed contracts under glass. He knew everyone, or at least he knew everyone who used to matter. His expertise was a vault, and he was the only one with the key. But the world outside was changing, and he de-locked the vault door from the inside every time I brought him something new, a fresh idea, a piece of software, a different strategy. It was the same reaction, a pat on the head, a reminder that the real work was done the old way. The golf course, the handshake deals, the long lunches. I started to see it clearly. He wasn't a mentor, he was a gatekeeper. And the gate was closed not to protect the kingdom, but to protect his own position within it. My growth was a threat to his relevance. So I stopped trying to open his gate. I decided to build my own door. The realization was a cold, clean shock. It wasn't about winning arguments with him. It was about becoming so competent, so undeniably skilled, that his opinions simply ceased to matter. I identified the gap. It was data. He operated on gut feeling and decade-old market trends. I saw the future was in predictive analytics, in machine learning models that could spot opportunities invisible to the human eye. He called it voodoo. Called it my curriculum. The investment was brutal. My life disappeared into a blur of online courses from universities I could never have afforded to attend in person. My living room floor was a sprawl of textbooks on Python and statistical modeling. While my colleagues were at happy hour, I was in my apartment coding. I spent my weekends not relaxing, but building a portfolio from scratch. I took on tiny low-paying freelance projects just to apply what I was learning to real-world problems. I failed constantly.